Hi, everybody. I'm Marianne Moenraj, and I'm here
I
with,
am Benjamin Rosenbaum.
that's right, and this is the SLF's podcast. Moenraj and Rosenbaum are humans.
Or
Um,
so we claim.
that's right. And we usually we talk about all kinds of things, often writing, but sometimes parenting, living in two different countries. Ben is in Switzerland, and I'm in America, although he is from America originally, and I am from Sri Lanka originally. And I'm giving you all this context because it's going to be relevant to today's episode. Um, and
We swapped hemispheres.
Yeah, we also talk about religion. I am a lapsed Catholic, is I believe what they would say. I would say I left the church when I was 12. They never really
Uh-huh.
let you go, right? You're either a Catholic or
Interesting.
you're
You're
lapsed.
lapsed. Yeah,
You're lapsed,
it's like
right?
it's like a library card.
That's right. That's right. So, I was baptized into the church. I was even confirmed against my will because my parents felt very strongly about it. But even though I had left and I felt like I was lying to everybody,
Oh wow.
I did go through the confirmation thing at 13. Um, Although you have to choose a saint, and the
Uh-huh.
saint, I don't know if I told you about this. The saint
You did. You
I
chose the
chose,
most rebellious saint.
yeah, Kateri
But
Tekakwitha. So
who's
anyway,
say explain wait, tell us who the most rebellious saint is. All I
well,
remember was the most rebellious saint.
I don't know if she's the most rebellious, but she's a Native American saint, Kateri Tekakwitha, and she didn't want to marry the man her father chose for her, and she joined the church instead. And um, she was also into scourging herself, so she's just an interesting figure.
Hmm?
Not conventional. We'll put it that way. Anyway, so I have been cheerfully agnostic for the rest of my life. I'm now 51. And
You were
Ben is
never glumly, always cheerful.
pretty much, yeah, I think so. And then Ben is, well, you can speak for your own religious status. I don't want to
Right.
misstep
Well,
there.
the funny thing about it is that it means a different thing. Like
Right.
when Christians, and this is where it gets complicated, when Christians and
Mm-hmm.
post-Christians talk about it, they're talking about what you believe. Whereas I think
Mm-hmm.
all Jews instinctively think that when somebody says, "What religion are you?" they are asking you what holidays you celebrate. Like that's the baseline,
Mm-hmm.
right? The baseline is like, "So what do you say?" Like that's a synonymous question. So,
Yeah.
right? Anyway, I'm Jewish, Reform Jew. I'm a bit on the synagogue of a board for board of the
Yeah.
synagogue, which is it's not really Reform. It's European progressive and everything that's not Orthodox, because there's not enough not Orthodox in Basel to have multiple. So there, it's a broad church. But yes, which, does not tell you anything theological.
Yeah, no, I mean that is, and we
Half of
haven't.
my congregation are atheists.
So I'm going to try not to dig into that because we did this in an earlier episode, and so
Yeah,
we'll
yeah,
try
sure.
and have Darius find it in the show notes. But we did talk about the fact that my framework for religion is about belief, and it's challenging for me to remember that it is not the same framework for other people. So
Right.
we kind of got into a bit of an argument, and now I'm like, what was I arguing about? I mean, like, in any case, it's just that my default is like, well, I can't be a Christian because I don't believe in God, and Ben can be Jewish whether he believes in God or not, and
Right.
right. So that is anyway.
Which I sometimes do and sometimes don't. It depends on the day.
Yeah, yeah. And I would say I'm agnostic in the sense of like, I lived in the Bay Area and lots of people there define themselves as spiritual. And I would say if there's anything I believe in, I mean, I guess I'm a secular humanist. I believe in people, but I would like there to be, in some sense, I guess, if they were at least neutral towards us, I would like there to be larger beings. I don't know. I'd like
Mm.
there to be more to the universe than just us,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
I think it's the believe thing is so funny to me because it's a little like I feel like also I don't know what like privileged people sometimes, middle class Americans, whatever, the way I grew up, and I'm talking about myself, have the sense that if we have the correct opinions, that's going to really be important. Like like I grew up in a household where like my dad
yeah.
feels guilty if he didn't read yesterday's newspaper. He's got to catch up by reading. And I had this attitude to the news, like, well, this is a very important thing on the agenda is that I figure out everything that's going on and have the correct opinion. And it has taken a while to realize that doesn't actually in and of itself do anything, right?
Right.
And it feels a little like that. Like it's very important that I believe that there are the correct number of supernatural entities. If it's 0 or 1 or many, I'm wrong. If I'm wrong about that, and I'm like, why would that even be? Who is asking you? Do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, not
Well,
who is asking you. Like, oh, it's important. It might, well, first of all, historically and politically, but you know what I mean. On some
yeah,
level,
yeah,
the fact that particularly the Christendom really
yeah.
scurries around, like it was vitally important that you have the correct belief. And I'm just like, there's so many other verbs that could
Hmm.
be involved, right?
Yeah.
Because like I don't know, revere or enjoy
Right.
or argue with or you know what I mean? Like
Right.
I wasn't believe. What is my belief? Anyway, so you
Yes.
anyway. That's part of my relationship to the question. Is it's like it's not that what people believe isn't interesting. Beliefs are fascinating. There's
Yeah.
a million beliefs, and I
Right.
love them. They're beautiful, but I don't know why we have to be right about it.
I
It's
mean,
more interesting to play with things than to
yeah.
be like if you have a relate if in your personal relationships you were like, well, the
Yeah.
important
Yeah.
thing is what I believe you are. Like, well, it's almost a little creepy.
So I mean, keep in mind that my relationship to Christian theology stopped when I was 12 or 13. I think
Sure.
where that comes from for me was that my understanding was that the church thought it was important, right? That
Oh, I
so
think they
yeah,
did.
yeah, yeah. So
There's a catechism. I mean,
yeah,
it's
yeah,
that
yeah,
is, and that's a and it's a anyway. This wasn't going to be the topic, but
yeah, yeah,
let's
yeah.
we'll go back to your.
It's
It's
relevant. It is relevant,
always
actually.
fascinating to me as a
Yeah,
place that different in different emphases that different
yeah.
historical moments, different religions have placed on different ways of relating to things. Anyway, go ahead.
Okay, so what we were going to talk about today was that a few months ago, I was invited to, well, I went. I went to Pakistan in uh, to teach science fiction for a week, along with Elizabeth Hand, to a group of young Pakistani writers. Not all young, I suppose, but young compared to me. So, I think they were mostly in their, I want to guess, 30s, perhaps. Um, it was a mixed gender group. I'm not sure how everyone identifies, but I think roughly 11, see, 15, 14 students, 5 men and 9 women, I think. But to give you just a sense of the feel of the room. And
Mm-hmm.
and then there were 3 of the organizers, and I want to give a huge shout out right now to them. And I'm gonna I don't want to mangle their names. I'll just refer to them by first names. Tassin, Noor, and Usman. And we'll have links to them and their work in the show notes. And Usman, I'll just note, won the World Fantasy Award. I think it was last year. Usman Malik for his collection. Oh God, I'm still getting older. My memory is just shot. But a
We'll
collection
put
of
it in the show notes.
Pakistani horror fiction, and which is now sold out. And I'm like, Osman, you need to do a second printing because I didn't get my copy. So we'll see what happens with that. There's my request to Usman: do a second printing, dude. You just won the World Fantasy Award for it. Other people will want to buy it. So uh, and then Tassin has been like the force behind the Salam Award. So the Salam Award, and I'm holding a mug, it's a lovely mug, it says the Salam Award for those of you looking on the video, was given to support Pakistani science fiction. They have a juried award. I sat on the jury a few years back. We read short stories that are sent in and pick a winner who gets a chunk of money, and at least for a few years, was flown to Florida to attend ICFA, the International Conference for the Fantastic of the Arts, academic conference for science fiction and fantasy, and where they got to meet people and be presented with their award and so on. And I kind of want to call all this out because it's an incredible, I don't know, it's a great example of how you build a science fiction fantasy community. And I think those of us in America have sort of like, me in my 50s, I came into it with the con scene and fandom well established, right?
Mm-hmm.
We'd already had the campaign to have Star Trek Back on the Air, led by the female, right, which was led by female fans, right, like that had actually like changed the minds of television studios. We had, I don't know exactly when that happened, but I was not part of it. It had been going on before I got actively involved in fandom. And when I was 10 years old, I went to my first Star Trek mini-con that was just held in a hotel near my house, and have been going to, I've kind of taken it for granted that there are cons. Any city I go to, there's probably going to be a science fiction convention. Here in Chicago, we have several. And we did an interview at the SLF with Silvia Morena Garcia, and one of the things I was asking her about, and she's a Mexican-Canadian author, and I was asking her about the speculative fiction scene and so on in Mexico, and she kind of said, you should go listen to the interview, but she kind of said there wasn't one, right, when she was growing up. Like, you could go to bookstores and you'd find some of the author's books, and that was it. Like, if you couldn't go to a con, there weren't any cons. There was no way for you to interact with these authors. A lot of my early writing education came from going to conventions and going to these panels, listening to authors talk. Sometimes they would have explicit craft conversations. Sometimes they would do the kind of terrible readings from the slush pile thing, which I don't really love, because it's, now cruel. I'm like, it's cruel, right?
Yeah.
But at the time I was 20 and I thought it was hilarious. So, because 20-year-olds are cruel, I don't know. But yeah, lacking in empathy, perhaps.
Throw 20-year-olds under the bus, why don't you?
Well, I don't know, not completely developed.
I encourage you to ask some 20-year-olds how they feel about 50-year-olds and whether 50-year-olds are cruel from their perspective.
All right. Okay. Yes. No, I know. I've got teenager daughter and son, and they would undoubtedly. They're not 20 yet, but anyway, fine. Speaking only for myself, I was perhaps a little lacking in empathy at 20. So okay, I had a whole plan for this episode, and I feel like it's going.
Or possibly you were socialized to perform different kinds of empathy at 20 than you are at 50. Anyway, go on.
No, I don't think so. I think I didn't feel it. I think I had little understanding of other vast swaths of human experience. Put it that way, right? So, it's not that I wouldn't care, but I didn't understand. So maybe that's the distinction I'm trying to make a little bit, right? Like, I had lots of caring. And like my college students and my daughter's friends and so on have so much caring. They are so kind by comparison to what we were like back then. But I do think there's, something to be said for life experience. Anyway, putting all that aside.
Although I think there are two effects, because you get hardened too. Like 20-year-olds are less clued in, because they've had less experience to all the way people could be hurt, but also they're less like cynical and jaded and hardened, and like have given up less on people in general not being hurt. So I feel like the empathy thing kind of comes out in the wash. Anyway, different failure modes.
No, I'll grant you that. I will totally grant you that. So they invited me to come do this thing, and I was obviously thrilled. What I was saying, just to tie up that end, if anyone listening to this is like, I'm in a country where, we don't really have a science fiction scene. I'd love there to be conventions. I'd love to have all this stuff that America has and the UK has to some extent, and Australia, I think, has to some extent. You can build it. And I would say, go find a scene, go find Usman, go find Nord. There's also, they have a magazine that will link to Tasvor. I'm not sure I'm pronouncing that right. And they're a great example of how you start building this from the ground up. So,
and I expect, although I'm curious to hear your experience, I expect that when you build it, it will also be different, and it will arguably, like in the ideal world, it then comes back and informs what we have in America and the UK and whatever, because whenever you do something, new and you do it again, it doesn't need to be it is ideally not a copy, it's a reinvention.
Well, they're all different, right? I would say even the local cons in America are different, right? Like WisCon and FogCon, which was a spin-off from WisCon, were consciously made very different from other cons, right? When they were founded. So, but yes. So, but I think there are some kind of common elements of like, well, what can you do to get a literary community to get you together, right?
Hmm.
And this is true for
Yeah.
any literary, and it doesn't have to be science fiction and fantasy, right? This can be,
Yeah.
I am in some random small town in America and we don't have a reading series. How do I set
Sure.
up a reading series? Things like
Yeah.
that.
Yeah.
So, and of course, you can come talk to me if I'm at a con. I love talking about this stuff. So this is my jam. So they invited me out there. They modeled it on a Clarion style workshop, but 1 week instead of 6 weeks. And
Hmm.
it, by that I mean that you have a set of students, usually somewhere between, Clarion I think aims for 17 or so, and teachers who come in, and the students write a story a week at Clarion, historically, although that model is constantly evolving and changing. And Ben and I will be teaching at Clarion this summer, and will not be expecting a story the first week when we're teaching. So that's already a
Well,
little
I think,
different.
yeah.
Yeah.
Well, yeah,
So,
but I mean, they'll be writing. They won't be.
right.
We won't be critiquing a story that week. They'll be writing week 2
Right.
story, week 1, I think.
Right. So for the Salon workshop, it's 1 week. The stories are written in advance. They're not written at the workshop,
Hmm.
and they're handed out. And so we read and we critique in the mornings. And then we did, and then the instructors met in the afternoons with the people who had been critiqued. And then in the evenings, sometimes we were off, but mostly we can gather together and did some other focused conversations. Or we actually, they had organized, we were hosted at Lum's University, and so we were working with the English department and other departments there, and so we had some recorded sessions, panel discussions, which we'll be putting up on the SLF site as well. Hopefully by the time this airs, they will be up and available. So we did one on the future of speculative fiction, and we did one on, it was on, I'm gonna forget the title, essentially about like, not horror as a genre, but like, it was more mood based, more crafty. Anyway, so
Horror as a mood.
yeah, not exactly. I'm blanking on the term, and it's not the weird. It was something specific, but anyway.
Hmm.
So I came out to do this workshop, and what I was going to suggest is that there's 3 basic areas where I was surprised by what I encountered in Pakistan, and
Hmm.
so I was going to suggest we talk about those 3 areas today, and like first 2 briefly, and then the last one probably after the break, at somewhat more length. And the areas would be gender roles, alcohol, and then writing in a theocracy. So if that works for you, Ben, yes?
Sure.
Okay.
It was all in
So
English. I mean, obviously your part was in English because I don't think you
my
speak
part
Urdu,
wasn't
but
my
like,
part was in English, and some of the
but do they
students,
also have Urdu workshops, or are they
I don't think, well, I mean, Pakistan has a rich literary tradition,
Mhm.
not a science fiction tradition, right? But there's absolutely,
Probably depends on how you define it,
right.
but
Yes, but yeah, but like there's well, we'll get to that actually, because the kind of role of writing about spirits and so on is interesting,
Mhm.
in how it intersects with religion. But there's certainly a incredibly rich poetic tradition, and
Mhm.
we actually, one way in which this workshop was different from Clarion is that we didn't critique on Wednesday. Instead, we had a day of visiting cultural sites, and we went to a museum. We went to various heritage sites, including the home of sort of a literary figure in Pakistan who had also been involved with the resistance movement
Mhm.
against the British.
Mhm.
And
Were
it's
they
fun.
coming from a long way? Were they local to where you were, or had they traveled from different parts?
Somewhere from Lahore. Many were from Karachi, so they had
Mhm.
traveled a significant distance to get there. Um, Many hours by bus if they came by bus, right?
Mhm.
So, or a flight. So the yeah, and even, honestly, I live in Chicago. The only time I go to historical sites and so on is when I have relatives or friends in town, right? And I'm like,
Mhm.
oh, let's go see
Yep.
the things. Maybe not the only time. Sometimes I take my kids to the museum, but but generally it's easy to not go. So I think even for the people from Lahore, many of them
Hmm.
had not been to the Lahore Museum, right?
Yeah.
So and the idea was that this would enrich their writing and so on.
Hmm.
And the reason I was mentioning it is because it was funny. I posted a photo of the salon, the place where this personage had held all these literary salons right at their home, and over many years, and they had, musical instruments and so on displayed there, but also like a selection of daggers. And
Hmm.
someone I on Facebook commented that it reminded me of Ireland, and it really is. It's a
Hmm.
very similar feel to it in terms of there's a rich musical poetic tradition
Hmm.
that they take very seriously, and which was bound up kind of tightly
Hmm.
with sometimes violent resistance against
Yeah.
British imperialism. So
Hmm.
um, so little, I don't know, that was fascinating. Okay. It's all preface. Look, guys, we got half an hour of preface.
It's not just all we talked about
Yeah, yeah,
things.
yeah,
Keep
yeah, yeah,
going.
yeah, yeah. Okay, so gender, and this is, I guess it's gender and violence is, I guess, the first topic, and I just
Uh-huh.
want to touch on it briefly. So, what do you think people said when they heard I was going to go teach in Pakistan?
That you'd have to wear a veil, or I don't know, something.
It was really interesting. I wasn't expecting it, right? I think
Hmm.
my assumption, I've been to India, I'm from Sri Lanka,
Yep.
and I think I'd assumed it's going to be like visiting India. You'd wear, you'd cover your head when going into a temple,
Hmm. Yep.
but or a mosque, but other than that, I just, and you might like in when I went to temples in India, if I was dressed like an American and wearing shorts, they actually had like
Like
sarongs that they'd
yeah.
loan out to you that you could wrap around
Uh-huh.
your legs, so you could be modest in the
Sure.
temple, right?
Right.
So
Right.
it wasn't particularly. It was gendered in the sense that only women were expected to cover their heads, but
Hmm.
the general modesty presumption was for everybody, right?
Yeah.
Um, and 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 so some of the people who were, I mean, people asked me if I'd have to wear a burqa to teach there. So that to me speaks of, a real, I mean, just not understanding Pakistan and not having a
Uh-huh.
real sense of it. They sort of think of it as
Yeah.
like, lumping all the Middle Eastern
Right.
countries together. Pakistan's not actually in the Middle East, but nonetheless.
Right. Right. Right.
Um, and
Well, and
all,
probably they're thinking of Afghanistan too. Like,
yeah,
that's the
and lumping all the Muslim countries together, and
yeah.
Saudi Arabia, and so
Right.
on, like kind of like this big kind of group thing of, you know oh, those are the countries that don't let their women go out uncovered, right? Like, and
Hmm.
so, and my image of Karachi and Lahore is, oh, those are cosmopolitan cities. I was sort of just assuming that like I could dress however I wanted and there would be a big mix of people. My assumption
Hmm.
was also not quite accurate, right?
Yeah.
So just to be clear, like I'm not setting myself up as having some great understanding, right? I just
Hmm. Sure.
my so that was one thing that people assumed. The other question I got a lot was, will you be safe? Right.
Hmm.
And sometimes they were talking about gendered violence.
Hmm.
Sometimes they were talking about terrorism. Right.
Hmm.
And I also thought that was interesting because,
Yeah.
like, I don't know, when the IRA was bombing in London and bombs were going
Hmm.
off on the subways, people kept living their lives, right?
Right.
And I think
Sure.
most people who were planning to visit England didn't like cancel their trips. I don't know, maybe they didn't.
Right.
Maybe some of them did, I don't know, but I wouldn't have. So I
Right.
don't know. There's a certain
And it's the kind of thing where it's like people are more, afraid of sharks than mosquitoes. It's like,
mhm,
if you were at the height of IRA bombings to get killed in London, it would probably be because a cab hit you, not because you got in an
mhm,
IRA bombing. It's more,
right.
it feels worse. It feels scarier and more, but like statistically,
Yeah, right. I mean, humans are terrible at
but I don't
estimating
know.
risk.
I mean, that's not
They
true. That's not true at all times. There are
Yeah.
places where,
Well,
of course,
and
human
yeah,
violence is the worst cause,
right. Well,
but,
and there are places,
sometimes
and
we,
there are definitely. I mean, I went and looked because I was like, am I just wrong in my estimation that I will
Yeah.
be pretty as safe there as I am in Chicago walking down the street at night, like,
Hmm.
and I'm an urban city girl. I'm kind of used to a certain level of
Right.
situational awareness and,
Yeah.
knowing that things can happen. Um,
Not only that, an American urban city girl, because,
yeah,
you know,
I know.
a,
Wow.
a urban city girl from a country stuffed with firearms,
Yes.
right? So, I mean,
Yeah,
that is also
yeah,
a very funny thing that people, it's always this grass is always greener, or the other
yeah,
way
yeah.
around. Like you project fear and
Hmm.
because Europeans are terrified to go to America. When if
Yeah,
Italian kids want to go to America, I mean, and objectively, America, you are way more likely to get shot in America than most places that are not active war zones, right? Like
yes.
so I mean, particularly, but of course, if you're American, you're living you actually can read the hyper segregated map. So you're sitting in
Yeah.
Oak Park going like, what? But America's not, but like you're literally 20 kilometers from, you know,
No, more
uh,
like more like five, but yeah,
5 kilometers, right?
yeah,
But
yeah,
but but it's like there, and there's checkpoints and barbed wire,
yeah.
but there's just this implicit,
Right.
it's much smoother than that. But essentially, America is hyper segregated into zones of extreme violence and
Yeah.
zones of tranquility. And like, you look at it from the outside, you look at the average, and it looks
Yeah.
like
No,
anyway.
and when I lived in Philly, it was literally one block. We lived at 17th and Lombard, and Lombard is, if you go one block north, you're at Rittenhouse Square, which is like
Yeah.
the ritzy part of town, all the nice restaurants and shops and so on. Lombard that we lived on was kind of a quiet residential street. And then one block south was, I think it's called South Street, was fine most of the time, but
Hmm.
definitely at night, like higher level of violence, and you've got to be aware, right? And
Yeah.
mostly we
Yeah.
didn't walk one block south, right? And
and
so
and
it's,
sometimes that stuff is objective and real, and sometimes
yeah,
it's also highly subjective. I mean, the
yeah,
most striking example of this for me was when I lived in a kibbutz in Israel, and there's a kibbutz, and then right across the road was the Arab village,
yeah.
and the kibbutzniks were like, "You can't go to the Arab village; that's too dangerous." So of course we went to the Arab village, and then the people there like gave us tea and took us in, and were like,
Hmm.
"Are you living in the kibbutz? That's like, so we're so worried about you, right? Like living among those
Yeah,
Israelis." So it's like, you know what I mean? It was like,
yeah,
oh, those
yeah.
Israeli
Well,
Jews, they were all Israelis,
and here
but
in Oak Park, we have this, ongoing thing of, there's a whole, so it's not that we're not allowed to put for sale signs on our properties. Legally, we
uh-huh.
are, but we have
Huh.
a strong cultural prohibition against it in Oak Park
Why?
because it used to be a tool of segregation. And there's a
Oh.
whole history. And Oak Park has been
Oh, interesting.
very actively anti-segregation since the white
Huh.
flight era, and certain
Uh-huh.
things have evolved as a result.
Wow.
So
How
if
interesting.
if you go to there's a, I'm going to forget the name of the agency, but there's a housing agency here.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
one of the things they actively do is let's say you're looking for an apartment, you're moving from the city, they will show white people apartments in historically blacker parts of town and vice
Hmm. Hmm.
versa, because otherwise people will tend to self-segregate, right? They
Uh-huh.
will,
Interesting.
and
Wow.
so this is like a very conscious decision to, like, and if you just go to
Wow.
a realtor, realtors will just do this as a default. They'll look at you. This is
Mm.
not to say every realtor is
Hmm.
racist.
Sure, sure.
This
But
is just as
it's the
a kind
path
of,
of least resistance. It's
yeah,
systemic.
yeah. They're like, they look at you and they're like, oh, people like you live here, right?
People like you live in
So,
this, right?
and
Exactly.
so,
It
and then
just produces.
you end up with pockets of whiteness, pockets of blackness, etc.
The
And
realtors
so,
are the realtors are essentially acting like AIs. That
yeah,
right? Like it's
yes,
exactly all the
yeah,
racism of AIs is that they're like, we'll
yeah,
just take what is and like
yeah.
exaggerate that by
Right. Well,
predicting that it will
and we
continue.
all, and we'll all do the same unless we're, because
Yeah,
we are just as programmed, right? If we are
sure.
not actively pushed in other directions.
Right.
There's a book,
Right.
I don't know if I can pull up the title right away, that like goes into this in detail, specifically to Oak Park. If anyone's interested, I can try and
We'll put it
dig
in
it
the
out.
show notes, but we're going to get back to the topic
We're gonna get back
because
to the topic. We're gonna get back to the topic. Um,
so people thought you
so
would have to
well,
wear
oh,
a veil and it would be
so the,
dangerous.
well, and the violence, they also, I just want to be clear, there are areas of Pakistan, more
Hmm.
rural, etc., that there is active conflict going on. So
Sure,
yes,
sure,
like
sure.
there,
Also borders, right? I
yeah,
assume.
yeah, the
Like,
military, so the military, the government guidelines will tell you where is safe to go and where is not safe to go. I
sure.
would say Karachi, Lahore, you are going to feel like you're in another American city or another European city or whatever. It feels similar. They did tell us that in Karachi, like the students were telling us that there is a slightly higher rate of phone stealing. Like like if you have your smartphone out, you might get mugged
Yep.
for it.
Uh-huh.
We didn't have that feeling in Lahore. Lahore is also like the cultural center of Pakistan. It's this rich historical cultural place, and so it just has a different feel to it as a result. I haven't been to Karachi, but my impression is that Karachi is a little more of a bustling urban sort of place.
Yeah.
So people had these assumptions. As it turned out, I got there and went straight to the campus, and the campus was felt like my campus. There were students in shorts, female students in shorts. There were female students in tank tops. There were also people wearing hijab. There were also people wearing, now I'm going to get the terms wrong, not full burqa, but there's an intermediate stage between hijab and burqa, and I can't remember what it's called, and apologies. So there was a whole range of dress.
Yeah.
And so, one of the professors that came to meet us was wearing a tank, a sleeveless short dress, right above the knee, right? And I was like, okay, this is how I dress to teach. Like, I can just continue on as I was. I had packed enough modest like garments to like, if I needed to, but I'd been told I didn't need to. I did ask in advance, and they were like, and the male conference organizers had asked their wives, who had then like come back to me with like, you'll be fine,
Yeah.
maybe don't wear a mini skirt on campus, and otherwise you're good. So when we went into the city, it was interesting because during the day, I definitely felt like if I wore shorts, people were staring a little bit, like everyone was staring. And one of the students, the way she put it is, it's not hostile, but they don't know what to do with you. They don't know how to read you, right?
Yeah.
So they're kind of trying to parse it. And I think that's an important piece of what I wanted to get at today is, and maybe this is relevant to, like anyone writing about aliens and culture clash. I'm reading one of Jeffy Kennedy's books right now, and she's got it's a fantasy romance, and she's got a character coming from a very egalitarian society, and she's encountering this man from a very male dominated society, and they keep misreading each other. This is a traditional trope of fantasy romance. It allows for a certain amount of hotness from transgressing gender norm type stuff, right? And transgressing feminism type stuff. So it's useful to think about. So and that kind of, if you write science fiction first contact stories, like that kind of idea of it's not just that like someone's going to be transgressing against your culture, it's that they're going to be acting in really alien ways, and you will not be able to make sense of it because it's not going to slot into any of the slots your brain has open. Does that
and there's a couple of possible reactions to that, because in culture clashes, and I have a lot of experience with this, being a cross-cultural relationship and being an immigrant, it is that that's actually a best case scenario. Like a best case scenario is that you encounter an alien something that's alien to you, and you're conscious that you're confused by it, right? Because that's like a place where you can then, you're open and curious and construct a new model. The worst case scenario is where you confidently misread it. Like they are acting in a way that does have an inscribed cultural meaning in your culture, but it's different. But you're convinced that that's what it is because it's a false positive, right? Like it matches. Like someone from my culture would do this if they were an asshole, like that. You know what I mean? That's like the worst case scenario. Anyway.
No, that's good. And I was just looking up the book of Chafis I'm reading is called The Pages of the Mind, and it's the first book in a series. So if people want to read it, we'll link to that. But there's a moment there that's exactly what you're talking about, where a man from a society with very segregated gender roles, males do this, females do this, encounters a woman from a different society, and what he ends up deciding is, well, she's not clearly not male, she's clearly not female, she must be a third gender, she is
Hmm.
a female of the 13 kingdoms, and like he's now
Hmm.
constructed a new space in his head for that
Yeah.
role, right? And now
Right. Right.
now he's looking for the rules that define it at the point in the
Uh-huh.
story I'm at. And so yes, that is like the best case scenario. That's like where you expand.
Hmm.
And anyway, I guess that was sort of what I experienced in Lahore, was that generally I did not feel under threat. It was just
Hmm.
that for my gender presentation, it was
Hmm.
that people were confused by me, right?
Hmm.
They maybe seen it on television, but had not encountered in their
Yeah.
daily lives women who looked and acted the way I was acting, right? So
Hmm.
so that was just kind of fascinating. It did feel, there were moments that felt a little scary. So for example, we were out in the evening at one point shopping, and there were basically only men on the streets. And
Hmm.
I was like, whoa, suddenly this feels threatening, right? And
Yeah.
not that anyone offered any active threat to me, but they stare,
Hmm.
right? So, and
Hmm.
having all of these men staring at you, it's hard
Yeah.
for that, not like, it's not that any individual one is scary, but a mass of
Sure.
them is
In aggregate.
scary. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I asked, like, where are all the women? And the one of the student I was talking to, she said, oh, well, they're at home taking care of getting dinner ready and getting the kids, they're home from school and so on and so forth. And I was like, huh, I've never lived anywhere where women disappeared off the streets so completely
Yeah.
at dinner time, you know, like
Yeah.
um so that was interesting. Also, the other place that it was very visible was at the airport,
Hmm.
because generally I was the only woman who was like pulling my own bags.
Hmm.
um the women had men with them to deal with
Hmm.
that, right? And or
Yeah.
they hired people. Hold
Yeah.
on one sec, I have to send my daughter a text back telling her I cannot give her a ride to her sweetie's place. uh Sorry, recording a podcast. Okay, so so she's gonna have to walk. Tragedy. um the What was I gonna say? So yeah, so the airport did definitely feel a little bit like, huh, when I hadn't noticed this as much when I arrived, because Tassine was on the same flight from Doha to Lahore as me, and so we had met up when we got off the plane.
Hmm.
And so I had a male escort,
Hmm.
I
Yeah.
wasn't thinking of him that way, but I had a local guide who happened to be male and who kind of like smoothed all everything for me. So
Hmm.
coming back,
Hmm.
I was on my own and it was much more visible.
Yeah.
So I don't know if I guess a question I have for you in relation to all of this, that's just, and there were other little things like, I swim for exercise, and
Hmm.
the there was, I could swim there and I could swim in my regular one-piece suit. I didn't have to wear something more covered, but I could only swim during women's swimming hours. They're
Hmm.
segregated, right?
Yeah.
And so there were little things like that. I don't know whether any of this, do you feel any of this when you're traveling? I guess you've traveled a
Hmm.
fair bit. Um, do you
I
feel
mean,
do you feel, and now you've got a daughter who travels and your
yeah.
wife travels and so on. I don't know whether the places you guys have
I
gone
mean,
has,
well, I mean, in my, I mean, we used to range a little bit farther afield, but honestly, we haven't been. I mean, mainly been in Europe and
mm,
America. Um, and I'm not sure
and in
that
this,
there probably are nuances, but I mean, one thing I know, I mean, I don't think on the level that you're talking about. I mean, I guess, yeah. I mean, I was in Egypt briefly. I mean, but I'm not that well traveled in terms of outside of America and Europe. One thing I remember that just off the top of my head that is not really the same thing, but that I remember when I first was in Italy when I lived in Italy for 6 months as a like 30 years ago, um, that I remember there being struck by this very different cultural construction of gender,
mm,
um, where it kind of felt like, and it was connected to a whole lot of things, but it was sort of like there was this very, and partly it's unclear how much of it, as every time I compare
mm-hmm,
any two things, America's such a big place, maybe
Yeah.
there were places, you know what I mean? Like it was my
Right.
America compared to where I ended up in Italy.
Right.
So it's
Right.
always, there are plenty of confounding factors. But it definitely felt like um, there was this narrative about men and women, which was present in America, but it's much more exaggerated among the
Mm-hmm.
people who I knew in Italy, where and not, and it was a narrative because it's one of those things where it's the general expectation you have about how people function and you say it
Mm-hmm.
rhetorically. But so the idea was that men wanted one night stands and women wanted,
Relation.
relationships, and like that, like to an extent that like every joke was about that, and there was all that,
Mm-hmm.
there's just and there's sort of this absolute default assumption, and that it was sort of constructed like a game, like it
Mm-hmm.
was like everybody was in on the game. You know what I mean? Sort of
Mm-hmm.
like the women all were supposed to expect that the men were up artists, and the men were always supposed to expect that the women were trying to get them into relationships, and that was like everybody, it's almost this competitive sport, right?
Mm-hmm.
That was the narrative about it. Now if you actually asked, what about this couple, they were like, oh, he's totally in love with her and she doesn't want to, like, obviously it was fun. Like from my point of view, it was not supported by the data. Like it
Right.
wasn't like they were actually all, but it was the, when you entered a place, this default assumption, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I was coming from Brown, which had like co-ed bathrooms. Like it was
Right.
so, it was very much this, and it was like, we didn't, like, there was no, very little, dating didn't really exist, right? This was like
Mm-hmm.
a portion of the American landscape where it's like hooking up with friends was the way you know what I mean? There was
Oh,
some big
really? Okay.
complicated, yeah, it was like some big complicated, it wasn't like it would seem very exotic to ask. I think at some point I asked somebody on a date, but it was like camp. You know
Yeah,
what I
yeah,
mean? It
yeah,
was
yeah.
like, we're gonna go on a date. You know what I mean? Like we'll
Yeah,
get
yeah, yeah.
dressed up and go to a restaurant. It just seemed like we were
Yeah.
playing at adulthood
Yeah,
or
yeah, yeah,
something.
yeah, yeah.
Because
No.
like the standard mode as college students was like whereas you were all in similar sweatshirts and jeans, and you were all like
Mm-hmm.
at a party, and at some point people would hook up and then try to figure out if they were in a relationship. Like that was the
Right, right, right.
standard
Okay. Yeah,
model,
yeah, yeah. So,
as
okay, I'm
opposed
sorry.
to like,
Yeah, I would
anyway,
agree. That was
yeah.
basically what it was like at U Chicago too. So like I had one guy who was interested in me who I'd met at a
Mhm.
con event or an internet event or something, who came to
Yeah,
town, and he took me out on
yeah,
a date to a French
right,
restaurant. And
right.
Adam, if you ever hear this, it was a lovely date. But I didn't know what to do with it. I was like,
Yeah, exactly.
this
It
is
seemed
so
very like
strange. This was so
I'm in a
strange,
movie,
right?
right? Like
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
suddenly, are we in
There
a rom com? Like what's going on?
I little plates with tiny portions, and
I
I
know.
think I was
It's
supposed to
like,
wear heels for this. So
exactly. Like
so
it just seemed very alien. And then I get, to go to Italy, and everybody my age, like the same, was definitely like all dressed the women were dressed to the nines, they were in heels, and like, and it wasn't just dating, it was like it also was like this weird slide from catcalling. Like I was in a
yeah,
situation in America in which, like, if a stranger made a proposition to you on the street, that was clearly an act of violence.
right.
And also in Italy, often an act of violence, and people didn't like it. But on the other hand, it was sort of like this part of this game where, like clearly there was like some context in which, you know what I mean? Like it was,
So well,
which is
I
partly
will.
like just an openness to people meeting each other on the street, because also in non-sexual context, people would sometimes come, and I don't know.
So I
Anyway,
will. So I'll
but it was,
say that act of
yeah,
violence thing is really interesting to me because I've been catcalled in the street in America quite a lot, and it sometimes it reads threatening and sometimes it
yeah,
reads as a compliment, and
right,
it's a very
right,
subtle nuance. And I can sort of give you, I mean, but there are
yeah,
factors that go into it going either way. Like
yeah,
if
yeah,
I'm walking down the street, this happened to me in college. I'm walking down the street, and a
yeah.
bunch of guys in a car slow down. It's night,
Oh, that's
and
creepy.
are
Yeah,
catcalling out the car at me. That is
right,
threatening. I am then. We didn't have cell phones
sure,
back then. I would have been on my phone to campus police, like saying, "Hey,
right,
this is
right,
happening. Keep an eye on me."
yeah, yeah,
So that was scary. That was probably the scariest version of it. On the other
hmm
hand, I used to work downtown in my 20s, and I was expected to wear, heels and a skirt and hose and that whole thing. In fact, once got sent home from a secretarial job because I hadn't worn pantyhose. So the rules were pretty rigid, in
uh-huh,
ways that I think are hard for my students now to understand, which is great. Um,
yeah,
so I would be dressed like this and walking downtown, and I walked past a construction site once. There are a bunch of guys there. This is broad daylight. And
hmm
they were, I think, mostly Hispanic, and they read me as Hispanic.
hmm
So they were calling out lots of compliments in Spanish. And
hmm
yes,
Yeah.
technically it was catcalling, but
Yeah.
there was the come to bed with me, but it was also like, oh, will you marry me? Do you have a boyfriend? Like
Right. Right.
like it was, and it did not feel at all threatening. And
Yeah.
it didn't even feel like they were hitting on me, because they were
Right.
working and I was
Right. Right.
clearly
Right.
going to work.
Right. Yes.
It was
That it
just
was a
like,
game. That it was
it was like
playfully.
a
Yeah.
sweetly flirtatious, like they meant to be paying me
Right.
a compliment. And I
Right.
could read
Right.
that, right? And
Right.
you know,
Yeah.
and
Yeah.
it's even like the guys who tell you to smile, they tell you to smile, that's usually obnoxious. If
Yeah.
they say you have a lovely smile, it could be
Right.
aggressive or it could be lovely. I was in New Orleans, and there was a older Black man, probably in his 80s, who told me how much he
hmm
loved my smile, and it was
Right.
lovely. It was a
Right.
lovely, warm human moment. So
Yeah, well, I mean, I think what really is
yeah.
going on is that patriarchy has fucked everything up, right? Because
Yeah. Yeah.
if we didn't live in a world of terrible hierarchical violence, like it would be perfectly natural to be like, oh, you're beautiful to like lots of people that you met,
Yeah.
but because we we're in a war zone as
Yeah.
far as like gender, like
Yeah.
those moments, it's like there are, and I think if like there are probably like moments of grace where like two people are just like
Yeah.
chatting and but it's funny how it's like from what I hear, like in a way I feel like it's also this very funny thing where like it's gone from like the situation I was describing where it was like, well, we would go to parties and hook up with friends um and but like addressing a complete stranger on the street and trying to
Yeah.
get with them would be absolutely crossing a line, whereas in Italy that was much more of a slippery slope. And to where like now I hear reports of like youth culture where it's like actually if it's not online, like if you're not going through an official dating app, it's already creepy. Like even trying to get with
Mm.
someone, like hit on someone at a
No,
party is like you're
really.
doing this in person, that's fucked up,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Like,
That's
like
interesting,
it's
right?
not
Because
mediated through the
well, it's
app.
not, yeah, yeah. Like, I mean, in
It's
person,
funny.
obviously there's all kinds of ways in which uh you have to really know the codes well to not come
Yeah.
across as creepy, right? Like in
Right.
some sense, right?
And the
And
apps sort of afford everything where it's like we're
yeah.
clearly here for this purpose. I've tagged these things as long as you're following the
Mm-hmm.
conventions, like it's very
Yeah.
legible. And by contrast, because that makes it so simple, by contrast, this sort of like, you know, talking to somebody at a party becomes this like, either, it is a natural reaction to then say, well, this is not the appropriate venue for this
Right. Right.
agenda.
That's right.
But
Especially because you're drunk and you've kind of backed me into a corner here, right? And
well,
there's
that would be bad. But
right, right, right. No,
obviously
no,
there's
but that's where it comes from, right? Like it comes from the
yeah, yeah,
fact
yeah.
that like so often there is not an there, and really like it would be interesting to connect this to gay culture party
hmm
behavior
hmm
versus
Yeah,
het culture, right?
straight, right.
So straight culture. So,
Yeah,
but but that's why I mean I would rather like if I were a young woman, I can totally see the appeal of saying like, this is a power neutral environment, right?
the apps. Yeah,
The apps, right? As
yeah,
opposed
yeah.
to
Right,
parties where there's always kind of like
right.
some awareness of physical strength, cultural norms, etc. at
Yeah,
play,
right.
right? So
Sure,
it's
sure.
the apps are equalizing in a really interesting way. Anyway,
Yeah,
so I guess I have one
that's
more
interesting.
question about this.
Yeah,
I mean, I'm sort of poking at this a little bit because I think Americans, a lot of the people I was talking to kind of assumed like, well, we're liberated and everything's fine here, and you're
right,
going to this horribly sexist
right, right, right,
place, right?
right.
And
Exoticized, dangerous place. Yeah.
my sense is that, and kind of what I wanted to get at with this whole episode is that we normalize what's around us and take it
Right.
for granted, right?
It's easy
And
to see the
so
splinter in someone else's eye.
right. And so, if I go to, you know, uh, if I walk down the street in a sports bra, right, and
hmm
pants, right,
hmm
if I'm running, in America today, that's generally considered okay, right?
Yep.
Like it's considered decent dress, like whatever, acceptable
Sure.
dress. If I walk down the street and let me note, I am 50 and I'm not comfortable doing that. I would
Hmm.
feel not sufficiently dressed. But if my daughter
Hmm.
wants to do it, I'm fine with it because I'm aware
Hmm.
that the social conventions have changed, right?
Hmm.
But if I wanted to walk down the street, if she wanted to walk down the street, or I wanted to walk down the street in like a lacy bra, not a sports
Hmm.
bra,
Right.
that would then be starting to be transgressive, right? And
Uh-huh.
again,
Sure.
you can maybe kind of get away with it to some extent, but you're pushing the norms a little bit, right? So I'm curious. You have a wife, you have a daughter, you know,
Hmm.
how would you have feelings about it if they wanted to do that, or if they, let's say you were going to the beach and they wanted to go topless at the beach?
Well, the funny thing is that so I mean, in terms of like the Swiss uh, sexualize less than Americans. So there was
Mhm.
a very funny like thing where we were early in our when I first lived in Switzerland. This is probably like 92, and we were living in maybe 94. We're living in Bern, and like there's a river, rushing river that rides through Bern. It's the middle of town, and there's like park alongside, just like grass and stuff next to it. And there's some swimming pools, and there's a little bit of more of a cool vibe stoner park that's a little past the swimming
Mm.
pools under the bridge with graffiti. And like people like lay out their towels and and the first time we went there and Esther just like took off her clothes and put on her bathing suit, and I was like, whoa, holy crap. Like you're naked. What's going on? Americans like
Yeah,
nakedness
yeah,
is sexual. But that
right.
I'm whereas where which does not mean like they were in some ways they were there are other things about which they were more prudish that were
Mm.
like Americans would make crude sexual jokes in a way that the Swiss were a little like it's not that time of the evening yet or whatever. But being naked wasn't it didn't fall in the category of like sexual. I mean,
Yeah,
it was like I'm not you wouldn't walk down the street naked, but it was clear that
right.
if you were just like taking off your clothes to put on your bathing suit, that was just like a practical. You know what I mean? That was just like
That's
a that was
fascinating. Yeah,
you're
you
not
don't.
attempting to draw attention to yourself. You're just
Yeah,
transitioning from one state to another, right? Like you couldn't walk through
yeah,
the street naked. You'd be more likely to see somebody walking through the street naked in America because they'd be like it'd be a political statement or
right.
they'd be or they'd be some countercultural thing or
Yeah,
whatever.
yeah, yeah.
They'd be they would be
It
transgressing a
is, by
norm,
the way,
but
legal in Berkeley. So
yeah, yeah,
just to say, there's one city in America where you can
sure.
walk around
Oh,
naked as much as you want.
I
So
remember my friend Jamie telling me with great pride that UC Santa Cruz is a clothing optional campus. That's
nice. No, apparently there was a student at Berkeley who went naked for four
yeah,
years,
sure,
basically.
sure,
So carried a towel around with him, and
yeah.
so to sit on.
I mean, there are
So he was
communities of
hygienic.
like
Yeah,
naturists around, like
yeah,
there are some in Switzerland too, and I mean that's
right. So
anyway. So
so I just
yeah,
it's funny. Like I would, I'd ask when I was having these conversations with female friends after I came back, and I also want to highlight that in Pakistan, the modesty culture is for everybody. So men mostly
hmm
don't wear
hmm
shorts either,
right,
and
sure, yeah,
and they don't tend to even wear short sleeves, tank tops. It's like your arms and
yeah,
legs are covered, and it's also practical if you're living in a hot place with a lot of sunshine much of the year.
hmm
Long,
sure,
loose, white, light colored clothing is going to keep you more
right,
comfortable
right,
than
right,
shorts, right? Like
right.
where the sun is
They
like
really just don't
beating
want to get
down.
sunburned. That's
Yeah,
what's really
yeah.
going on.
It's
The
so
what
so
one last thing on about the other thing about this. Well, I didn't mean to cut you off,
no, no,
but
no. Well, I was just gonna say the women I was talking to, like I would say something like, well, it's yes, like they'd stare at me, but if I walked down the street here in Chicago topless, they would
mhm,
also stare at me
sure.
and
Well, right,
probably more, right? And they were like,
sure.
they'd get this look on their face. Well, that's not the same thing. And I'm like, it is the same thing.
Yeah,
So
yeah,
yeah.
and the other thing is that it's in both directions, right? Like
Hmm.
so which I'm very aware of because Switzerland has this sort of. I mean, Switzerland has went nuts about. Oh, that's probably not the appropriate term. Switzerland got confused and made some dumb laws regarding Islamophobic laws.
Yeah.
That's like a big hobby horse. There, particularly in places that they've never seen particularly in cow towns in the middle of Switzerland, they've never seen a Muslim. They are very hot to ban minarets, right?
Yeah.
So there was an initiative banning minarets, an initiative banning burqas, which both of which made me completely furious. And I mean, I was saying to somebody at some point, the most anti-Semitic thing that's happened to me is in Switzerland is the minaret ban, right? Because it's just
Sure.
like, even though it's not directed at us, well, you
Yeah.
know what's going
Yeah,
on
yeah,
here.
yeah, yeah, absolutely.
Because their argument was that a minaret is a symbol of power. Like it's not a religious. You can build a mosque because that's religious, but once you build a minaret, that's a symbol of power. Where do
Really?
the Swiss get this idea? If you look out my window, the
Yeah.
landscape is dotted with church steeples. Every
Right.
town has a
Yeah,
church.
yeah,
So
yeah.
if you guys think this is a symbol of power,
Yeah,
like
yeah, yeah, yeah.
that makes me feel pretty fucking unsafe, surrounded by
Right.
these,
Right,
points
right.
stabbing up at the sky with crosses on them, right? Anyway, so uh but the thing about it is that like there was all this faux feminist stuff, and some of it, to be fair, like I don't like the people who I have the most sympathy with who supported the burqa ban. The only people I have any sympathy with who supported the burqa ban are Muslim and ex-Muslim women in Switzerland
Right,
who
right.
they get to say, right? That's fine.
Yeah, yeah.
But everybody else I find, was confused. And the um and it's one of these things that is treating the symptom, right? Because it's like
Yeah.
if people move here and like it's illegal to not, like I don't know, it's like a predictable result that is a lot of women just wouldn't leave the house,
Right.
right? If they rather than anyway. But the other thing is that nobody, it seemed like nobody made a big enough of a deal of the fact that what was happening here was that the Swiss legislators were telling women to take their clothes off. Like, is that
Mm,
not equally creepy or more
yes.
creepy as telling people to put clothes on? Like, a law that makes people put clothes on could be restrictive of freedom, but a law that makes
Mm,
people take off their clothes, isn't that
yeah.
arguably worse?
Yeah.
Like, how
Yeah.
would you like, you know
So
what
I
I mean?
think,
Like, I just,
right.
yeah.
So I think, you're using the word confused because you didn't want to say nuts. And I
Well, because
think,
it's ableist. Because it's
right,
able. Because I
right,
don't
right.
actually
Well,
think.
well, no,
Because I
well,
don't think they're suffering. I don't think
no,
they're suffering from
no,
many
no,
health
no,
problems,
no. Well,
right?
what I was going to say is I don't think confused is right either. Um, I think it comes out of racism and Islamophobia, right? I mean, that's
Well,
really
yes.
so that's
Oh, it's
that
100%
is so
racism and Islamophobia.
that's kind of what I want to kind of just
But I
bring
do
to
think that
the
that is a kind of confusion. I mean, I think that that's at the heart of a lot of it. Well, I mean, I'm using maybe confused sounds too
I just
mild a word,
well, I just want
but
to
what
be
I'm saying
but I
is
want to be well, okay, go ahead. I want to be more
I'm not.
precise about it because I kind of want our listeners to think about when you have this feeling of
Yeah,
like you see someone
yeah.
in a burqa and your assumption is, oh, she's terribly oppressed.
Hmm.
And, or I have students who wear hijab all the time in my classrooms at UIC,
Hmm.
right? And if your assumption is she's terribly oppressed, you're going to be very surprised when those women open their mouths and start talking because they are,
I mean, again,
yeah,
scenario, you're surprised, right? Like worst
yeah,
case
yeah,
scenario, your framework, your
yeah,
filter that you look through it is so dense that you're not even able to perceive that that's what's going on, right?
yeah.
Or
But
you're gonna
they
avoid
my
cognitive dissonance by compartmentalizing it or something.
maybe, yeah. But I mean, I would say that my hijabi students have often been some of the
Sure.
most outspoken women,
Well, of
very,
course, because you
and
kind of have to be a bad to be hijabi in America, right? Because
yeah,
you're making this choice that's and you're getting all this shit thrown at you. Like
yeah,
obviously, if you're in a secular, environment
yeah,
in a college campus, like you have to be a badass, right?
yeah,
Um, uh, I mean, just to make any choice to visibly mark yourself as different is
yeah,
like, right? And anyway, I don't know. I think that but confused, I mean that as a pretty trenchant word. Like I think that like that is what I mean is a combination of like misinformation and
hmm,
programming, right? Like
right,
essentially having been fed
yeah,
a line of bullshit by your culture, but that isn't sufficient to
hmm,
like because you could think critically about it. What I mean by confused is like unwilling or unable to like follow, like resolve and investigate the contradictions in the
yeah,
propaganda to the extent that you are, and there's often an emotional basis for it, right? Like it's
yeah,
often out of like fear and insecurity and sometimes the emotional basis has some germ of a legitimate root, right? Or it's like Switzerland's a small country. It is has it, there is some authentic feeling like uh we have these traditions. Like, what if nobody celebrates Fastnacht anymore? What if nobody
Hmm.
speaks Baselitz? What if the things that I love, because it's not America. This isn't, we're not talking about the MCU here.
Yeah.
There's like a few thousand people who do this thing that I love, right? And
Hmm.
if someone were to come and take it away, that would be that's the the kernel that I can have some compassion with. The fact is
Yeah.
that but what I mean by it's confused, it's like then they've been bamboozled into thinking that these people who really just they'd like to be in a Fastnacht clique too, right? They like to
Right.
come and you know what I mean? Like they'd be happy to share. Like you could
Yeah.
try some of their food and they could go to Fastnacht, whatever. But like they've been positioned as a threat to this thing that you care about, and
Yeah.
therefore you have to squash them, right? And you're in a zero-sum scarcity mentality. And I think, I mean, there's lots of that's toxic and it's destructive and it's evil, but like at the root of it, like some people are cynically evil, some people are like
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
manipulatively,
Yeah.
but
I
most
don't.
people, what they are is confused. What they are is like
Right.
they've been convinced that this is a threat and it's not. And that
Yeah.
is,
Or they've never had,
it's
I
hard
would
to get
say,
out of that rabbit hole.
yeah. There also, I think what I encounter is a lot is people who have not even had the argument made to them, right?
Yeah,
Like where
right. Well,
they
they've
have
only had the propaganda argument
they've
made to
only
them.
had the propaganda and they've never really had a um, a space where they were encouraged to consider some other sides and
Yeah,
come to their own conclusion about it,
right.
right? So all right, we're
Which it describes all of us about various
yeah,
things,
yes,
right?
yes, right.
There are
No, so
lots of
that's
places we,
and
all of us
it,
haven't
yeah,
been
and like
challenged and haven't been.
when I say racism and Islamophobia, I don't mean to exempt myself from it, right? Like I think this is where it's
Totally.
useful to think about the three definitions, three ways in which the term racism gets used, right? Which is
Mhm.
like there's the case one is like the KKK, like
Conscious belief
outright,
system.
outright like we want to burn crosses on your lawn, fine,
Right.
right? And we're happy to lynch you, right? um
Well, and I think case one is still also like milder versions, like where it's like, well, I just believe that biologically, like that's
okay, yeah,
still like conscious belief system. Like I actually think this is case one, right?
yes, I think so. Sorry, I have to think about that for a second, but I think that's right. Case, let me lay out case two and case three.
Okay.
Case two is belief systems. I'm trying to think whether it matters whether they're conscious or not. I'm not sure. I would put case two as sort of like you're not going to go out and like do evil things to your neighbors, but you're walking around with a set of racist assumptions, right?
Hmm.
So
Yeah.
whether you're aware of them or not. And
Well, the
then
reason I make the distinction between the conscious belief system is that often when you talk to people, a lot of heat instead of light is generated in conversations about racism. Because when you talk to people of a certain generation, like who are around in the civil
mhm,
rights era, there were racists who were like, I am a racist. I think that non-white people are worse. That those people were out and proud about it
right,
and
right,
loud.
yeah,
So that's what a racist is. So if you go and
yeah,
say, oh, you have
okay,
these implicit assumptions, they're like, what are you talking about?
right,
I know I'm not a racist because I've seen racists and they say it out loud. But that's the
right,
type one is the people who are like, this is actually what I believe. And it's you have to get people away from that
yeah,
notion of it
okay, yes,
for them to
okay,
understand that what
right,
it is
right.
to have,
So right,
have absorbed all these assumptions.
case two is the one where if I say we're all racist, that's what I'm
Yeah,
talking about usually is
sure.
that kind of like we are all programmed, we're all
Yeah.
sexist, we're all ableist, we're all carrying
Right.
around
Like, how
these
could we not be? We
assumptions,
were
right? And
soaked in it from birth.
hopefully we're getting better, but and interrogating those assumptions. But and then case three is the power plus privilege case where, to use my family as an
Mm.
example, my parents may well have had a whole bunch of racist assumptions about white people when they came as immigrants to the US. I would say they
Not much they
did.
could do about it. Yeah,
I would say they did have those
sure.
assumptions, white men are slutty and whatever else, right? There's
Uh-huh.
a reason you don't want your daughter to marry one.
Right, right.
He's just going to cheat on her, blah, blah, blah.
Hmm.
But
Hmm.
um, but they didn't have the power to
Yeah.
do very much about it.
The
Like
winds of history were not blowing in their direction.
yeah. So that's the power plus privilege version of racism.
Sure.
I did, and Ben knows this,
Power
but
plus prejudice. Right.
I did a, yeah, sorry, power plus prejudice. Thank you. I did a whole thing on Scalzi's blog back in the
Back in the day.
2009 when science fiction was going through its race fail
Yeah.
thing, which you can look up on
Spasm,
Wikipedia if you're not familiar. But
which was interesting because it presaged so much of
yeah, Yeah.
you know, what happened in ensuing decades in the rest of the world.
I mean, I think I would kind of
I
class
mean,
it
had
with
been,
the consciousness raising of the 60s. It was us going through our consciousness
yes.
raising moment,
I mean,
right?
that's
Like, yeah.
definitely a good analogy, but I partly mean like the effect of the internet. Like this was a group of people who were online early, and so you saw a lot of the things that became like the major political issue and the kind of online conversations that were a major driver of political reality in 2016
This will be
were
quick. I
already,
just
you
thought it
know,
was very
informing
interesting
science
because I'm
fiction in
not a big
2009
drinker.
and in ways
It
that
did not
when
occur
a
to me
lot
to
of people I knew
think about
didn't
before I
even have
went.
a Facebook account yet. You know what I
You know,
mean?
I
Like
got there
anyway.
the first couple
All right,
days.
so we are at an hour.
We were super
I think
busy
we
with
should
writing,
pause,
and I just
take our
traveled. I
break,
didn't
And then
really
talk
come
about your other
back,
two
think
issues.
about alcohol
Well,
at
I'm going to
all.
hit alcohol.
But
I'm gonna
on
try to be
Wednesday
really
we had
fast
this
on
cultural
alcohol
day, and
because
we
I
went
want to
out to a
get to
couple
the religion and
restaurants,
writing piece
and
of
there
it.
were on the menu there
So
were things that were called
take 5,
cocktails,
and we'll be back.
and the students
Good.
reminded me
Moon Rock and
politely
Rosenthal
that, you know, of course
arguments.
there's no
Stay
alcohol
human
in
for
them,
these 5 minutes.
and
That's right.
that of course was fascinating to me because I would have assumed we're at a restaurant, it says cocktail, there'll be
Right.
alcohol in it. I had not
Hmm.
looked up the laws in Pakistan before coming on alcohol because
Yeah.
I'm not a heavy drinker, and it turns out that, and this is a change, this is something that came in a few decades ago with
Hmm.
a more conservative government.
Hmm.
People used to be able to drink alcohol more
Yeah.
freely, but it has been made illegal in basically, I think, the same sort of way that prohibition happened in the US,
Hmm.
right? Like,
Yep.
so that there are exceptions. There are a few hotels that serve Americans and that are or visitors and that are
Hmm.
allowed to sell alcohol to them and serve alcohol to them. So you can buy bottles of alcohol there, or you can get
Yeah.
drinks at the restaurant. And there is a thriving bootleg industry. Although one of the travel blogs I was talking to warned you that, like, you want to go and like be chummy with the villagers and drink their bootleg alcohol, but be aware that it might kill you because,
Yeah.
you
Much like in
know,
Prohibition, like
right,
bathtub
right,
gin, you might go
Rocco,
blind.
right? Yes.
Yeah.
So, so
Sure.
be aware of that, and generally don't. So I was talking to the convention organizers about this, or the workshop organizers. I was like, you know, if you keep doing this and you're bringing Americans, you should warn them because some of them are used to having
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
cocktail or two every night,
The
and
sort of classic writer's bar
yeah, and
thing. Yeah.
so they need to know what
Yeah.
they're getting
Getting
into,
into.
right?
Sure.
So I thought that was really interesting, and the prohibition
However, it
is,
would be worse if you banned coffee. I expect that would hit writers harder.
yeah. Well, and this I was on to talk about this because in Utah, coffee
Uh,
is banned, right? Like,
oh
you
wow.
are right. Caffeine
Yeah.
is, so it's the same. It's all coming to the same thing.
Yeah.
Caffeine in
Sure.
is considered a drug. It is a
Yeah.
drug, right? And you're
Sure.
not supposed to ingest drugs. They're bad for you.
Yeah.
So,
Sure.
so in Pakistan, if I'm remembering, I wrote this all out. Now I'm like, do I remember it all? It's a religious prohibition. You're not allowed to sell alcohol to Muslims, right?
Oh, okay. Right.
So, which is why the hotel restaurants can get away
Sure. Yeah.
with it. But so much of the population is Muslim, something 97%, something like that, that it ends up becoming the default, right?
Sure.
And so similarly, I think, so, and then in Utah, you're not allowed to, what is it? You're not allowed to sell hard liquor unless you belong to a private club, which you can join for like $50 or something, right? And then
That's
you
how
can,
smoking works in Basel now. There's
oh,
like a
really?
club, like you can't sell anybody cigarettes except in a private club, and then there's like a chain of effectively like smoking restaurants. But everybody to go in them, you have to join the club, and then they're all like owned by this private club that you're now a member of, so you can smoke. That's like how it's like the workaround for there being smoking restaurants still in Basel.
It's interesting, right? And
which is a huge change since I first got here, when everything was there was like 2 non-smoking restaurants, and I couldn't deal with the smoke. I would like seek out the non-smoking restaurants. Now everything's non-smoking except
well, and I
if you're a
can't,
member of the special club.
we're a smoke-free campus now, and like,
Yeah.
when I went to college, I had a professor who chain smoked in class, right?
Yeah,
And we
yeah.
just all had to cope with it, right?
Right.
So in a little room. So
Did people smoke? Are cigarettes also banned in Pakistan? Like tobacco?
I don't know. I don't smoke, and it didn't come up. I didn't
Yeah.
remember seeing people smoking, but I could have easily missed it. So, Yeah, I don't know. And so in Utah, you also can't get regular beer because it's considered too strong. So you have 3.2 beer, which is a lower percentage of alcohol.
Yep.
That you can buy, which then means you have to buy more of it to get drunk if that's your aim, right? So
Sure.
they thrive in.
So at least you'll be hydrated. You'll be drunk,
yeah.
but you'll be hydrated, so it's a compensating.
So there's and the restaurant
They're looking out for you.
makes more money, I guess, right? Because you have to buy more
Yeah,
beers.
they're looking out for the restaurant too. Yeah,
That's right. So, and there is a thriving across the border thing where you go across the border, you're
no
having
doubt.
a party, you buy your alcohol and bring it back, right? So, and
it's sort of like it's like we grew up, except instead of it being like 18 or 21, the age limit is just 200. You know what I mean? Like it's just all the adults are reduced to like smuggling out alcohol, doing all the behaviors teenagers do, right?
Yeah.
Probably going across state lines or getting a friend from another state to buy it for them.
So I think what's really interesting is like if you compare it to something like seatbelts, right? Seatbelts, I think, which by the way, I hate wearing seatbelts. I find I'm short enough that it lands right at my neck, and so I always feel like they're choking me. And
it might be worse in that case.
Well, they're not really. If you were thrown forward, it would then be hitting your shoulder, right? So it would do its job. You know, and if it really bothered me, they actually sell these padded things you can put around it to like make it anyway. But I used to resist wearing them because I had this very American freedom, blah, blah, blah. You can't tell me what to do, you know, kind of COVID, whatever, right? Like that whole, like, you can't make me wear a mask. You can't.
Right. Well, it's the same thing. Again, I was going to say, you're saying seatbelts also true of masks, right? Like
right,
it's
right.
the same.
So
like we are talking about public health mandates. In some ways,
so that's interesting, right? So like with the COVID thing, it's super clear because it's a communicable disease. With seatbelts, like my argument used to be when I was 20, like, well, it's just me. How come, you know? But in fact, it costs the state money probably if people are not wearing seatbelts, get into serious injuries. Many of them won't have a health insurance.
Well,
the state ends up paying for the emergency room care. You know, so it costs all of us money if people don't.
I mean, alcohol falls somewhere between masks and seatbelts.
Hang on, I want to get there. So, well, I think alcohol is. So hold on a sec. So those two cases, I think, are at least, you know, like it takes an extra step to get to why seatbelts are a community health concern and a community budget concern. Right. It'll, you know, it really kind of comes down to you're going to cost us money. None of which is what convinced me to start wearing seatbelts. I think it was Jed saying to me, when I'm driving and you're not wearing a seatbelt, I'm so anxious. And I was, eventually I was like, well, for the sake of the drivers and the other people in the car, for their happiness, I will wear the seatbelt I hate. Right. So, and then eventually I didn't learn how to drive.
I'm swelling with pride that Jewish health anxiety has achieved this victory.
So, you know, I didn't learn to drive until I was 30. And so, you know, as a driver, I always wear my seatbelt. But even if I'm the only person in the car, I've accepted the public community need for this. And it's probably good for my own health. So fine.
Alcohol.
Alcohol is
we only have 30 minutes left for the thing that you really want to talk about.
Well, that's what, yeah. We'll
all right.
I don't know how much
wrap up alcohol.
So alcohol is interesting because it lands on the line with religion, right? In that, you know, here in the States, there are lots of places where you can't buy alcohol on Sundays, right? Or you can't buy it Sunday mornings, right? And that to me is super clearly religion related, and it's something that people take for granted. No one's out there like fighing for the right to buy alcohol on Sunday morning.
This is where we started having the debate beforehand, and so I mean, we'll have to decide how much we want to time on this. But essentially, it's kind of like, this actually kind of goes back to the thing we were saying at the beginning about how, like, when people ask me what religion are you, I think they're asking me what holidays do you celebrate, right? Like religion as this, like, I think there's a certain kind of, I don't want to say this in a delicate way. There's a certain kind of narrative in American Christian, by my definition, atheism,
Okay.
Because most of the atheists are Christian by my definition, right? They celebrate Christmas. And like if they seriously wanted to put skin in the game, they would stop celebrating. They would stop with a Christmas tree, right? Where because it's about belief, right? And religion is a whole separate, and because there's this thing that hardcore atheists and hardcore evangelical Christians believe on, which is like there is a single fact of truth. Either Jesus Christ was the savior or he wasn't. And if he was, then you should believe 100% the Bible, which they don't mean because they don't actually read the Bible literally, because that's nonsense. But anyway, they would just do all these things that I tell you to do because and if it was ever true that if it ever wasn't the case, then you'd be a fool to do any of that, right? So it's sort of like this idea that that there's logic and reason and like how you think about the world normally, and then there's a super special case where there's something so important like going to hell or whatever, where it's like, well, then you should suspend all of your faculties of reason and like deep into this other thing. And so that model, that idea about religion is this special is very alien to most people in most of history, in most of the world, right? Because most people, most of the history, most of the world were like, there's theology, which is like what you happen to believe. And there's like a bunch of different things, like creation, and then there's like the laws of the community you live in, and whatever. And it's all kind of munged together. But like, there's no hard line between like saying lighting candles on a tree versus a menorah. That's a completely different thing than like whether you. So, to my point of view, it's like everybody throughout history in all of these societies made like decisions about public health, right? They thought about like. What are the trade-offs here? How much do you allow people to do things that might be harmful to them? How much do you not? And throughout, all kinds of different people come in different places. And I have great sympathy. If we're going to go back to 1920 and look at 1910 and look at the temperance movement, I have sympathy on both sides. Like I can see why. And the same thing with like the current debates. Like, should marijuana be legal? Should heroin be legal? Should, crack be legal? Like, right? Like I'm very like. I think honestly that I'm kind of like, it probably depends on a case-by-case basis. If you could do it well, you should do it well. But the point is that people in pre-modern societies, when they come to a conclusion about this, would write it down in the kind of text that they had available, right? So like half of the stuff in the Talmud is not it's not like there were the people writing the Talmud and making rules about like how, like whether you need to give your neighbor his cow back when his cow gets lost, and like how many cubits away. Like they're making some law about that. It's not like they're making that law, and meanwhile there's the other totally secular scientific-based people who have the cow law that's not religious, but the cow law that's the only book they had to write it down in, right? So it's like, and everybody is always like, does it really matter if some American statesman is drawing on the Bible or like the writings of Cicero in arguing for some rhetoric? Cicero is also, I don't know, you know what I mean? It's like,
that's all fine. All I was trying to say is that like in Pakistan, it's very clearly tied to religion in that it is illegal to sell or consume alcohol if you are a Muslim. Like it's explicitly tied to religion. In America, people are not used to thinking of it as tied to religion, but it clearly is, as a sort of relic of the time when, like all of these townships and whatever were run by people who expected that all good God-fearing people would be in church on Sunday and you would not be drunk on the Lord's Day, right?
Well,
and
I understand what you're saying.
And this is also right.
But there's another piece of things which is Sabbatarianism, right? In the sense of like this novel idea that we're going to divide up the week, and some days are going to be different other days, and we're going to decide as a society that some of them. And now Switzerland, very Sabbatarian. Nothing's open on Sunday. It's not just you can't buy alcohol on Sunday. You can't buy anything on Sunday unless you go to the train station.
And is the library closed?
Yeah, I think so.
See, that's one that makes me crazy, right? So our library, I was served on the library board, right?
Sure.
And the library is closed on Sunday mornings, and to me that is a relative of a different.
But hear me out, because there's another reason you're not seeing. Because in Switzerland, it's a labor thing. But that seems true to Americans. Some people want to work on Sunday. No, but that's not.
I understand that. I see that, and I understand that.
But it's not.
But
it's not. But it's connected to the religion thing. But it's not so cleanly divisible. The point is, if you were a labor activist who makes no distinction between the days of the week, then you could be like, well, some people left Sunday, some people left Tuesday, whatever. But the idea that the society is going to be like, what if we all took the same day off?
Yeah.
And we all devoted the same day not to, what if we protected this day for all of us from commerce and labor? Like none of us were forced to labor, or as few as possible, maybe nurses in the ICU, as few of us as possible are forced to labor on this day. What would then happen? What would be the vibe of that day?
Right.
How would it work? Right. And I am a Jew in Switzerland. So it's like I would have picked Saturday. Saturday's the day I try not to do stuff. It's irritating for me that I could shop on Saturday, but I can't shop on Sunday. It's irritating to me. And in the beginning, I was just like nuts that they were like, you're closing things. I was furious at it. But I actually feel like, in a way, of course, that's why Sunday is the religious. It's a Christian, right? And that's clearly, on the one hand, that's very clearly 100% Christian. They did not consider whether it should be Saturday or Tuesday or Friday. It was always going to be Sunday. On the other hand, there's this way in which it's like we are actually going to not, it's sort of like all the other ways that labor laws protect. Like you can't, even if you want to do this because it's a way, because you're feeling desperate about money, you can't do it. We're all going to not engage in commerce on this day, and then we'll all be together in this non-commercial world, which you know have a lot of sympathy with, right? Like it's arguably.
I don't disagree with any of that, Ben, but it's only one factor, right? I'm pro labor laws. I'm a labor activist in many ways. So sure, but at the same time, if you look at libraries, right? I spent many hours trying to figure out library hours when I was on the board. And the default tends to be that the libraries are open 9 to 5 on weekdays and a few hours on Saturday. That's like the default being, it is set up for stay-at-home moms with kids. It's not set up for the library to be used by working people who like have a job. So in terms of labor activism, I'm like, well, our library is open late into the evening and on Saturdays and ideally Sunday mornings as well, because this is when people who are, maybe they need to go and do some research on, like, you know, getting a college degree or something like that, and they can do their homework at the library. They can access our computers. They can do this. It is a method of class mobility, et cetera, and so on. And it's
I'm not disagreeing with you about libraries.
So the defaults are set up for a gendered society where women staying at home, raising the kids, and men in the workplace. And you know, the library was where you kind of like took your kids to play with them. Men would maybe swing by, pick up some books to like read at home. And it's so
I see what you're saying. I think also there's a lot of these trade-offs in the public sector, which are interesting because it's like which thing is more progressive. This is a little like teachers unions, you know, where it's like it's not just for that gender society, it's also for the library workers, that they don't have to work at night or on the weekend. And of course, you know, it's like, well, which workers do we privilege? The ones who can't go to the library during the day, or the people who work at the library? So it's like, obviously there's some trade-off there. But I think there's a way in which it's not really possible to parse out, like, if you think that religion is this special category where there's all the things you would think rationally about the world based on your human sense of judgment, and then there's what God is telling you to do, and that's like a totally separate, which is, again, very weird way to think, like a very specifically, there's only some religious people in some very narrow parts of history who've thought of it that way, as opposed to it being like, there are all the things you traditionally do and traditionally believe and that you've thought about like together and do this thing. And like, you know what I mean? Like we have a tendency to like part of that is part of that is because religion is sometimes used.
Again,
part of that is because you're right. Anyway. So I don't like when people say this thing. I don't like when religious people will say the kind I don't like will say, well, this isn't up for debate because, you know, God told us it has to be this way, which is like, no, if you go look in your own tradition, there's going to be 5 people who had different interpretations of what God told you, right? But like, I mean, 5 different schools of thought or whatever. But anyway, so I'm just saying.
I agree. Like this is what we came to on the board. We didn't add Sunday hours back because it became clear the library staff didn't want to work on Sundays. It was going to be a hard push. We'd have to find people who wanted to work Sunday mornings. It might have been possible. There wasn't enough community demand for it. All of that is fine. Like I'm saying, the fact that it's Sunday morning that it's closed is a relic of a time when the majority of people in our community went to church on Sundays and Sunday mornings, and that's not true anymore. So
and there's also a puritanical thing about it being,
so I'm just saying, like, that is now that's something we should re-examine. And then if we as a community say we want a day off where nobody works, I'm fine with that, right? Like, then you're just balancing the needs of the community, and that's there are definitely some arguments.
And
in favor
I 100% agree with you. All I'm saying is that it's like this was a big theme in like that great book I just read, The Dawn of Everything, Graeber and Wengrow. Did we talk about that? That was a really great book. We should put it on the show notes. We should talk about that at some point. That book blew my mind. I already am a big David Graeber fan. It was his last book. He died. Anyway, but it's a huge anthropological history of like the last, 20, I don't know, since prehistory. Spends most of its time prehistory. And it's just about like the diversity of human cultures. And one big theme of the book is that like we tend to think like that we moderns, like it's happened very recently, like we're like, looking at the world, making empirical judgments about it, reasoning together, like deciding democratically, coming up with like experimental things and trying them out. And then but like everybody before like 1500 and still everybody who's brown, we think is just sort of trapped in this timeless, like the laws were given to them, or like it's like the idea that the big theme of the book is like always people were political, empirical, making these hard calls, so it's like, everything you're saying is right, that the community decides. Also, that was happening in like the thing that got codified in the Quran was because people in 7th century Arabia were having those kind of conversations and thinking about like, do we need a day together and whatever, right? Or do we need alcohol or whatever it was?
You're very defensive of something I'm not arguing against.
No, I'm not defensive. I'm just
you've been going on it for a while now. So I'm in favor. I agree with this. Yes. So let's
third topic.
Let's translate to the third topic, which I don't know that we're going to get to finish. But and this is the bit that was kind of like the most eye-opening for me when I was there. I had some surprises about gender, little surprises about alcohol. So we're teaching these students, right? They are great. I love these guys. They are brave. They are experimental. They're writing all kinds of things. And I'm going to have to be a little bit vague and not give examples because there is a danger here. So it is against the law to blaspheme in Pakistan, right? And interestingly, against any religion. So blaspheming against Christianity is just as illegal as blaspheming against Islam. Okay.
Right.
Historically, this was punishable with things like 30 lashes in theory. As far as I know, no one has actually had the 30 lashes applied to them. And even though I think that's still technically on the books, there have been statements made by prominent religious figures saying it shouldn't be. So I think right now, although things could change at any moment, that is unlikely to happen. But the big famous case is Salman Rushdie, who, when he published the Satanic Verses, had Khomeini, make sure I get this right, I think that's right, that Khomeini issued a fatwa against him and called for his death, right? And so you can be executed for blaspheming, for writing.
Well, wait, no, that's Iran. So what? Clarify how that applies to Pakistan.
Yes. So Pakistan has similar rules, right? So several countries have this. So in Pakistan, the rule is I'd have to look at the exact thing, but you can certainly be imprisoned. I'm not sure if you can be executed off the top of my head for writing blasphemy, right?
Well, given that execution is worse than 30 lashes, I would assume. I would assume that if they thought 30 lashes was too harsh, they would also think execution was too harsh.
I don't know if I'm not sure that's true. Right. But so I'd have to go look it up. I'm not sure. So the situation my students are in is not even necessarily that they are wary of the government deciding it's illegal. The problem is that let's say one of them writes something, it comes to some prominence, right? It becomes known in the outer world. The worry, I mean, yes, someone in the government could decide that it's blasphemous and they could be arrested for it.
Sure.
But what is more dangerous and what people have been killed for is mob violence, right? So
Right,
you go look up the history of this. And people will, and often there are some cases that I found like that were afterwards, people were like, oh, this person has been accused of this. And it turns out that his neighbor is trying to get his property and like wants to buy it cheap. And so the case gets thrown out of court. Right. So that's fine, but not fine if you got killed while you were waiting for the trial. Right. So which
is true anywhere you have this reporting culture, right? Anytime you have like a thing where, people can rat each other out to the government, there's this set of ways that you can,
So I think, I've never lived in that kind of environment, right? And so, when I think about,
I mean, a good American example of the ratting people out culture is that our very messed up laws around immigration make it that a lot of people are working in situations where their employers are abusing them because it's just one call.
So there are all kinds of cases like that. But I'm saying in terms of writing fiction, right? So I've never lived in an environment where writing fiction could get me arrested or killed, right? Or I felt that was an active threat. I mean, you never know what could happen, but I never worried about that, right? If I were worrying about social penalties, and I've written a lot of transgressive stuff, I'm worried that I will be that I write too much about sex and my parents are furious and have cut me off, and I mean that happened, right? And then people will yell at me at dinner parties. That has also happened. People will yell at me in the street. That has also happened. Like I'm worried about social I don't know what the word is, right? Like
opprobrium.
Yeah, but there's like a word for it, right? Censure, social censure. That's what I was looking for, right? Like that's the worst. Yes, I might get cut off from society, basically, right? And like have to go hang out with my group of weirdos and rebels and not be able to be part of mainstream society. So, but I was not afraid of physical injury, or the only time I was afraid of arrest, interestingly, was at the time of the Communications Decency Act, where there was this moment when Congress was deciding whether sex on the internet should be illegal or not. But they were very seriously trying to decide this. I got interviewed by the Philadelphia Inquirer. I was on, talk radio in Seattle, because I was one of the few people in that moment who actually was like writing erotica and putting it online, right? And those of us who were doing it were generally kind of mostly in contact with each other, and we had this conversation of like, if this becomes illegal, are we going to take our websites down, or are we going to keep them up and risk being thrown into jail, right? And we didn't get to the point of having to make the decision. It didn't pass, and so but I had to stop and think about it, right? And I was like, was I willing to go to jail for free speech? And probably yes. At that point, I was in my 20s. I didn't have kids. Like I probably would have. So that would have been a different branch of history. So, but my students, well, and then the only other time I've had to think about it was when I was writing about Sri Lanka and the Civil War, right? And there, when I wrote things about Prabhakaran, the leader of the Tigers, while the conflict was still active, there was a slim chance that I would make him angry, make some group of the Tigers angry, make some individual angry, and they might show up at my door and hurt me, right? It would have been more likely if I were living in Canada, which had a large refugee population of Tamils and active Tamil Tiger recruiting and fundraising and so on. I think I would have been at more risk. If I'd been living in Sri Lanka, I would have been at much more risk. People were disappeared from their homes, right? And certainly if I've been, again, like fiction, you can kind of get away with some stuff with the veil of fiction. But once you start using real names, or if I'd been writing journalism, journalists were killed, were disappeared,
Yeah.
were killed by the state. This is all super clear. And if anyone's interested in this, Sugi Ganeshanandan's new novel will walk you through it and break your heart. So I'm going to blank on the title again. We'll link in the show notes.
Brotherless
Night. Brotherless Nights. Thank you. So there was always that possibility, but I did not end up, my interest shifted, and I didn't write so directly about that, in part because I had this conversation with someone in Sri Lanka who said, you're writing at it from this distance. You're not a stakeholder in the same way. If you get things wrong, the consequences aren't going to be as severe for you. And it made me realize I felt like I had a real responsibility to get things right if I was going to do about it, and it was going to require a lot more research than I had time or energy to do at that point. So I kind of moved to writing, I wrote The Stars Change. I started writing more science fiction where I could talk about the issues without stepping in political minefields. But I think for most writers, that's
a good trick. Put it in space. Less.
But that's this is like, if you look at like Polish science fiction, Russian science fiction, I think there is a long tradition of this. You can't you're not allowed to speak.
Stanislaw Lem did.
Right, you're not allowed to speak against the state. So write science fiction, you can talk about the issues and not get yourself arrested. So that's as close as I've come. In Pakistan, one of my students brought a story in, and I think I can say this. In the story, she had written a story in which God was female, right? That's not a major plot point. It was just part of the story, right? And one of the students, as we were critiquing afterwards, we did the critique, and then we were just discussing, and one of the students was like, well, you can't publish this. What are you going to do with it? And it had not occurred to me that she could not publish it, because this story, and I asked, like, so just having God be female is blasphemy? And they were like, oh, yes, right? So that story is literally
Although
illegal.
What's funny about that is if you can't blaspheme against any religion.
I know.
What's funny about that is if you can't blaspheme against any religion, then like...
Right. But there's...
Surely saying God can't be female is also blaspheming against religions in which...
Yes, but this is... Logic is not applied here, right? Like, this is not about logic. This is about... enforcement of this. And so and I guess the part I really wanted to pull out, and this is, we can keep going and I want to hear your thoughts on it, but the last point I really wanted to make is that they were constrained, and they said, odds are if we publish it, no one's going to care, no one's going to notice, it'll be in some little literary magazine, 100 people will read it, it won't be an issue. But there is always the possibility that someone will look at it and get very upset and point out that it is not just socially censure grounds, but literally illegal. And then it could blow up into something big. And as a result, they have to constrain themselves, right? And this is where it kind of connects to the gender stuff before, because you think about women walking the streets, like not going out at night, or carefully choosing the clothes that they wear so that they, can't possibly be accused of being sluttish and asking for it, right? And we end up, we are the ones who are constantly enforcing these social norms, and will, in order to keep ourselves safe, will take a couple steps in from the actual, will be more conservative than the law even sometimes, right? Because it's safer that way, right? And as a result, we end up reinforcing the norms, right? That's my point. That's the thing that I guess I want everyone to be thinking about, because I think it affects all of us all the time. And in all kinds of ways. And, this religion thing and the blasphemy is specific to Pakistan, but, I'm watching Grey's Anatomy, and they have been having active episodes all season long about abortion. They are performing abortions on screen. They are having one of the doctors who is an OB-GYN, who in previous years was all about saving babies and helping people have babies, is so upset about America's Roe versus Wade being overturned that she is now taken to going around in a mobile van to states that it's made illegal to help these women. There's attacks on Seattle Grace Hospital because they're known as a place where people come to have abortions. And so the TV show is really, really actively engaging with this, anyway, I don't even, I'm like incoherent at this point. So, and as a result, like, it makes me think about like the things we're willing to say or not willing to say, right? So I had an abortion at 18. I mostly haven't written about it, you know, and I've talked about it publicly once or twice, but there is a big social pressure against it, even though, you know, it was legal. It wasn't even illegal. It was legal. Ursula Le Guin actually wrote about her abortion, and at a time when it was illegal, right? And it's I don't know. I just kind of wanted to kind of raise all of those concerns and the ways in which, you know, that the assault against women's reproductive rights is also religious, right? So to some extent, right? Not entirely, but it's certainly been weaponized. People's religion has been weaponized in the service of politics, I think, and keeping certain people in power, which is a whole other piece of it.
Tends to be.
Right, and that is also, you know, what happened in Pakistan, right? Like with the alcohol and I'm assuming the blasphemy thing, although I have not looked into the specifics of that. Okay. So okay, I'm going to pause and just let Ben talk for a bit about any of this, because I've now had my rant.
I think it's well, I mean, that's really, I think it's one of those things where I feel it's an interesting responsibility for there to be kind of like it's like a both and, like there's a middle, there's like some balance to strike, where on the one hand, you know, have been more restrictive than others, right? I mean, on the one hand, it's like it is actually something that we like. So I have two thoughts that are in balance. One of which, my first thought is like, what are we censoring ourselves about that we don't even know, right? Like every regime of censorship like is effective when people start censoring themselves, and even more so when they're no longer even aware of censoring themselves. And like, you know, a lot of, you know, you can see that sometimes when culture changes. I hope this isn't too much of a spoiler. I burst out crying at the finale of one of our favorite kids shows. It's probably not too hard to guess which one. You know, because there was like, because of the level of queer representation that I did not even know that I mean, like I theoretically was like, oh, it's a shame that like there's not queer representation in kids shows, but I was like the, and also and being like that there was this sense of like, what, you can't do, like this exhilarating sense of transgression. It's like they're not going to do it. I mean, I like, you know, it's like I was like, they will signal very clearly that these two characters are in love and they'll make it, but they're not going to actually have them have the kiss on screen, right? Like that's it was just beyond the realm of like like in a kids show in the 70s, you know, having grown up in the 70s, beyond the realm of like imagination, right? And so, you know, when they actually went there, I was like, oh my God, right? And that's in those moments you realize like, oh, there's ways in which we like the, you know, like the parable of the fleas that when you put a thing over the box and they hit the things, they stop jumping that high, and then you can take it away and they'll never jump that high again. Like there, you know, there's ways that we like learn to limit ourselves and like ourselves and we don't even know anymore, which just seems not. She's like, well, you wouldn't do that, would you? When freedoms open up, we're like, oh my God, that I didn't even know I was not expecting that anyone would ever do this because it's not allowed. Right. So that's my first thought. And then I immediately want to balance that with like, and I don't want to equate those two situations because like, you know, there really is a, you know, there is a distinct difference it's a spectrum, but there's a lot of different, like the consequences and costs are much higher. It makes me think of our talk with Yvette and Lovu, who is literally was, criticizing the Mugabe regime, and
Right.
that's not like you'll get canceled, right?
Right,
That's like
exactly.
you
Yeah.
would get murdered by the security services. That's like a different level, right? So it's
Yeah.
not equivalent, even if there are, parallels, or like human nature is the same, but like historical variations matter. I don't know. And I think that you know, I mean, one thing I wonder in a context like that is I wonder. I mean, one thing to be interesting to talk about is like what strategies people have used um, in those kinds of circumstances. And I mean, I also wonder if they're not like I wonder what the risks are of it. Like I I almost wonder whether you might ought to have smuggled out thumb drives of submissions to Strange Horizons, from the students, right?
I mean, they could, they also talked about, publishing anonymously. Unfortunately,
Yeah.
anonymous, pseudonymous, that often gets uncovered, right? So,
Yeah, sure,
so
sure.
that's
It's
that it's
risky.
not as
Yeah.
it's risky. It still has a level of risk. And where
Yeah.
I ended up, and
Yeah.
I think Elizabeth Hand was in a similar place. It was, as a teacher, it was very strange, right? Because normally, I mean, I taught a workshop while I was there, specifically on writing the taboo, right? And I said, and it was after we had this whole conversation, and I basically, we put all these taboo
Whole
things.
different context for writing the taboo.
So we put all these different things up on the board, like things that are taboo, talking about mental health, talking about class, money, how much, like things.
Yeah.
And then I said,
Right.
and then I was like, religion
Sure.
in big letters. But then I was like, I'm not even going to address that because I don't feel competent to
Yeah.
address it, right? Like this is
Yeah.
not
Yeah.
something. So
Yeah.
I said, as a teacher, I'm like, I want you to keep yourselves safe. And I think any given story
Yeah.
that they're going to write at this early stage in
Sure.
their career is probably not important enough to
Yep.
risk themselves for, right? So I want them to keep themselves
Sure.
safe and keep working. And maybe at some point they will get to a point where they are like, this story, I have decided it is worth the risk to myself, right? To get it out into the world.
Risk. Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
So
Sure.
So that's going to be
Sure.
up to them. And I also said, I think they need to talk to older writers in Pakistan who have been living and working under this to have a sense of how they navigate it, right?
Yeah.
Because that they're going to be able to give them better advice than I can. So, like at one point they said something about like, oh, we can't, even buy Salman Rushdie's books. And I kind of like took that at face value, like, oh my God, you can't even buy the books. But then later I was at a professor's house and he had a bunch of Salman Rushdie books on his shelf. Yeah. And I asked him and he was like, oh, you totally can. It's kind of seen as a badge of a certain kind of liberalism, right? And so he's a couple decades older than these students, right? So he's speaking from a very different perspective. So I just thought that was interesting, right? Like, and I guess, normally I would be pushing for people to transgress, right? That is, like, I think that's a lot of where exciting writing is. And especially not transgressing for the sake of transgressing, but because it's something that you want to say, right? And there's such a value in terms of changing the social norms and moving the Overton window in terms of like what's socially acceptable to talk about, right? When I was writing erotica in the 90s, you had to go to like smutty stores to, like men's sex stores to buy it. And then, but Susie Bright did the Best American Erotica series. Down There Press did Erotica. It started showing up at Barnes and Noble. And not that long after, people are reading 50 Shades of Grey on the subway, right? And so when I go to Pakistan and I'm wearing a tank top, I'm, sort of establishing a norm. Look, I'm a professor and I can dress like this and it's okay, right? So there's a value to that, but it has to be balanced against the physical risk, I guess. And that's the bit that I found hard.
Sure. Yeah. And I mean, it makes you realize what a luxury, I mean, even with certainly are, like, as I said, both things, right? So throughout the world, there's always censorships and taboos and pressures and whatever, but also it's not the same. It's not evenly distributed. Censorship is everywhere. It's not evenly distributed. So it's like, there's a way in which it makes you, I mean, it just makes you realize how, like, and I think even, I mean, how easy we have it, and even in, for some people, like, it can change very swiftly, you know, and I mean, there's this way. It'd be interesting to know what's happened recently. I'm not up on Pakistan's history there, but there's certainly been, it gets better and worse in different places, but there's a wave of, like, right-wing nationalism all over the world, right? And illiberalism, right? And, like, governments corrupting and destabilizing previously held norms, like in Poland and Hungary and Israel and India. There's all these there's like a very, not to mention in America with Trump, that there's like a concerted assault really on the balance of powers and things, separation of powers, and anyway, but I mean, which is bearing its fruits, right? Like, as you were saying about Roe versus Wade, I mean, that is like from this same, slide to the right that, the protests in Israel are about now. Anyway, so I don't know. And certainly there are people who are much more vulnerable in, where we are too. I mean, it's just people being, like a risk of mob violence. That's like, there are certainly parts of America where if your fiction outs you as trans, that's like, that's a real risk, right?
So I have two questions for you. So one is kind of going back to the Switzerland ban on burqas and so on. Like, I wrote a story, The Princess in the Forest, that has this, as a theme. There's a woman imagining herself as Sita, who, as his husband cheats on her, and she imagines a heated affair with Lakshman, Rama's brother, right? And when I published it, I got a couple Hindu people saying this was blasphemy. So, and I had this moment of concern, because for me, I grew up my dad would read me the Ramayana, and I thought of it primarily as an epic story, right? Like, and not as a religious text. But it is, of course, also a religious text.
Sure.
And so I then, like, reached out to my Hindu friends, and I was like, did I unwittingly commit blasphemy without realizing it?
Sure.
And the response I got back was, well, some people would think so, but lots of people wouldn't. And there's plenty of literature written about Sita and Lakshman. You're not the first to do that.
You're not the first to ship them.
Yes, exactly. And so it is.
Look on AO3.
They basically said, we don't think you need to worry about it either on a practical or a whatever level, but with the ethical level, right? But with the rise of Hindutva in India, I'm now like kind of thinking like, like, would I if I published this story now in a prominent Indian magazine, would and it came to people's attention, would it put me at risk? I don't know. Right. No blasphemy was intended, but I don't think that matters. Right.
Well, so I mean, I mean, as a big blasphemer, I mean, I feel like the orange is certainly blasphemy. But and that's important to me. That's like a itch I want to scratch in a way, because it's like a I think, as you were saying, the impulse to the taboo, like something that is not just things that are forbidden, but things that is held overly, that we fail to examine, or that we held overly preciously, or that we're overly reverent about. There's like as you say, not arbitrarily just to make trouble, but there's a way in which, like, the orange, which is in some ways a silly story, is also very serious engagement with, like, my alienation growing up in a culture with certain myths and stuff, right? Like, it's like me trying to make sense of that world, and really, I mean, like, there's you know, I don't know, spoiler, the orange is Jesus.
Okay. Oh,
Seen through a Jew's eyes. I don't
I'm
know. I mean, that's reductive, but you know what I'm saying.
we'll link to the story. It's only a
Yes.
page and it's fabulous. So
I mean, but but by the same token, I think we've been talking about sort of the external risk, and if you're in a place where, like, you know, there really is and oppressive, irrational government crackdowns can be about anything, right? Like, it doesn't, like blasphemy is a thing, but like, as we were talking to Yvette and Plovu, who's just like, that's not a religious issue, but they still would, she could easily have been murdered by the state, right?
yeah.
And but I also feel like, so there's that, which we've been talking about. The other thing, of course, is that there is the other kind of ethical responsibility, which I would assume was perhaps in the foreground when you were writing about, when you were shipping Lakshmi and Sita, which is Lakshman and Sita, which is like the, you know, the ethical risk of, like, particularly if you're, well, I mean, it's complicated in your case because this is it's your history, but you're not Hindu, right? So it's like, right? It's like,
yes, because of colonization, like my great great greats would have been, but
would have been, right? Exactly.
Yeah.
So so there's this way in which, and I have similar complicated, you know, relationships with, like, I feel like I feel like that I'm in a very different position vis-a-vis Christian blasphemy than I am vis-a-vis Hindu blasphemy, because after all, the Christians owe me, okay?
Right. Yes.
But, you know, there is this thing though about causing pain, right? Like playing with other people's sacred things, and that is, you know, so there is like there's two sides here, right? Like there's this urge to look where things are stuck and like transgress, but it's also like there's whether your own, like, your positioning matters, right? Like whether your cultural connection to it, whether that's coming from a place of like reclaiming something that's yours, or whether it's like you're just going around breaking things, which is not, I mean, I'm not, you know, like, I don't want to make a hard and fast
but this
rule,
is again, like, this is, you know,
but
when like Preeta Samarsan is a Malaysian born writer who South Asian Malaysian born, lives in France now, and she will often speak critically about Islamic gender stuff, clothing, etc., so on. And I feel like she gets to critique it, you know, and I you know, I don't have that relationship. I'm not.
Well, that's what I was saying before,
know,
right? It's like, I can talk about my mom, you can't talk about my mom.
Exactly. Right. You know,
that's totally fair.
So,
right?
so the Muslim and ex-Muslim women in Switzerland who were against the burqa ban, they get to make,
exactly,
you know, like,
I'm going to listen to them, like,
because it's coming from a different place than the casual Islamophobia or racism
which is complicated because of course it gets instrumentalized, and then on the other hand, so does you know, they also get silenced by the people who are, you know, it's complicated. But yes, it sort of matters, and so that is, like, blasphemy is also like, and that's also a thing where it's like religion is a special case, but really not, right? Because it's like what's sacred, and a lot of things are like the sacred. It's almost like the sacred is a more interesting category to me than belief, because everybody has things that are sacred, right? Like it's not a particular argumentative position to say that some things are sacred. It's like a way people work, right? Like things are, like, they're in, just in the sense that, like, there are things that it would hurt you to your core were they, you know what I mean? Like, it's, you know, I mean, I don't know.
I'm trying to think what I think of as sacred. That's an super interesting question that I've never really.
I mean, you're a parent, so there's got to be like, I don't know, people talking shit about my kids would bother me, right? Like, I mean, you know, it's like.
But is that sacred? I don't. That's interesting. Like, I don't know if I use the word in that way.
I mean, it's what I mean is sacred in Hebrew.
So I think I can give you an example. Like, pissing on somebody's grave would bother me, and it doesn't have anything to do with religion. It is just like it is a denial of their humanity. It's a
reverence. It's a denial of their humanity, and that's the kind of thing. Like, that's what. Well, that's why. Like I don't know. Like, exactly. But people actually misgendering people on purpose is blasphemy. Again. That is sacred. Like, people's relationships to their own, it's like people's self-determination, their relationships to their own self, that's sacred. Like, I don't know, it's like, again, I agree with you. I don't want to put this term in a box and be like, well, there's the religious. No, it's like everybody has things that are symbols of such importance to them, because you're right, the kids is a weird example because they're real people, but like pissing on the grave or like misgendering somebody, it's like this does harm because it is rooted in people's sense of what is central or what is important or what is like, and that, and so that it has both sides, because the things that are, I guess there's like a natural cycle where it's like there's a life cycle where the things that somebody has an authentic experience of connection and sacredness about, they revere, and then they try to get other people to revere, and that's okay. But then at some point, everybody gets together and like makes rules that you have to revere it, and it becomes like and then how racist the term sacred cow is. It becomes it becomes something that has a fence around the Torah, something that's like
and then it gets muddy because it does often connect to things like public
right.
health, right? And there are good reasons why you might want to like not have the entire community be drunk all the time, right? Like
right, So so you have something that is like, and you have something that is like full of people's like best thinking, and then and people have reverence for, and then reverence turns into a kind of policing of reverence. And then what I was going to say about the cycle is that somebody comes along and transgresses that and has the urge, because of the policing, to like mess with it and play with it and interrogate it, and then they create like great beauty, and then people find that sacred. So then actually it starts the next cycle. Like every religion that people revere, or every other ideology people revere, started as somebody's transgressive, like fucking with the previous regime, right? Like there's no, right? Like you know what I'm saying? Like there's
I see what you're saying. I'm not
Jesus
sure.
is a super transgressive idea for Jews, right? Like that's like you're basically taking the Jewish God, who is by definition, like the whole point is he does not have a body. That is like rule number one. The God is like an infinite bodiless, and you're making a guy who's supposedly that God, and then you're killing him. Like that is. Yeah.
Have you read?
That's a transgression, right? That's a transgressive, fucked up idea, and then it becomes something sacred for somebody else.
I think I didn't want to say. I agree with you on that example and many examples. I'm not sure I want to say everything starts.
Well, I don't know about every, but I think it's a natural cycle. But I think that if you look at the histories of religions, even within a religion, right? Even within, even like Isaiah is transgressing against, it becomes incorporated. But like, I bet you, if the people who wrote, and I'm going out on a limb here, but like, and maybe this is not the right thing to say, but like, just to take an example from a different tradition, like there's like, at the same time that Isaiah, there's a prophetic era, right? Around 500 BC, like around the same time that Isaiah is writing, around the same time as the Greek philosophers. It's also when the Upanishads were written. It's when Lao Tzu wrote the Tao Te Ching. And all of those to me have this vibe of like, we are going to, because the Upanishadic idea of like, moksha, of like, liberate, is like in a way the same kind of fuck you to the original like sacrifice and you'll go to the good place, right? Which is kind of like the Vedic thing. And then to be like, no, we don't want to go, we want to exit the cycle of rebirth, is the same kind of thing as the Greek philosophers going like, what if all the gods are just one entity that's mathematical? Or the Isaiah being like, what if it's actually about ethics and not killing sheep in the temple? Or like Lao Tzu being like, maybe you shouldn't be learned. Maybe the best thing is to destroy learned and reverence. Maybe Confucian propriety is the only thing left once justice and harmony are gone, right? Like they're all these, like this great axial era of religious imagination in the world spanning from the Mediterranean to the Pacific, is like, it's all kind of this transgressive reimagining of like what came before it. So I won't say all religions, but I feel like it's a common vibe.
I think that I guess the exception that keeps coming to mind for me are the kind of nature-based reverence for living in harmony with the land kind of things. Like I'm not sure that's a reaction against anything. Like,
well, here I have something really, because we really, if you ever have time to read The Dawn of Everything, I would love to have a conversation about it. But what's really interesting is its argument is partly that we tend to like noble savage these religions and talk about their reverence for nature as if it were not a conscious political project they have to achieve, but rather like this sort of state of nature and harmony, that, because as if they were other than like political. So the really interesting thing is, and I will give a very brief summary of part of the thesis of The Dawn of Everything, which I think is amazing, and it's an advertisement for the book. Okay. The Enlightenment, right? The Enlightenment, Rousseau, like all those guys, right? One of the things we don't think about in terms of like the Enlightenment and the dawn of the Age of Reason and all that is that just while people like Rousseau were writing their shit, a huge bestseller, like top of the charts in France, were like Jesuit debates with Native Americans. And the Native Americans were the ones advocating for human freedom. The Native Americans were like, why do you people have a king? Why do you live? Why does every one of you a slave? That's not how we live. We're free men. We like do what the fuck we want. Nobody tells us. We have a chief, but he's just kind of a coordinator. Nobody tells us what the fuck to do. And why do you believe that a god would enslave you and give you laws? And why do you believe like this relentless critique by Native Americans, one of whom was considered to be this, and often they were treated, later scholars would look at these characters and be like, well, this is sort of like a projected imagined other that like, so these characters in Rousseau and whatever, or in these dialogues in the French are talking about, they're just like, the Jesuits are inventing them as like to project these ancient Greek ideas. But as it turns out, we know they were real people. Like now we know, like in the meantime, like Kandiaronk was like this, I forget it, Seneca, Iroquois, somewhere in the Great Lakes area, Huron scholar and like statesman, and like had all these like the Pericles of the era, basically, like got the French to fight with the other tribe, and I don't know, like, you know, but you know, had all the, and like hung out and like knew French and like visited Paris probably, and anyway. So all this stuff is coming from that. And the interesting thing is, that's in chapter 1 of this book. And then later you find out this whole culture of like, yes, harmony with nature, also egalitarianism, whatever. If you go back and look at Cahokia, which is like this massive mound city in the center of America that had its cultural tendrils all the way from the Great Lakes to the Gulf of Mexico, like it was like this, similar to like Mesoamerican, this like massive like temple plain, like, and there's a period where they destroy it and break everything. And what it looks like in the archaeological record is a massive revolution. So the people who are like, and it's sort of, in the book, they trace like the connections between like what we know about Cahokia and what we know about later, and like to oversimplify, but it seems like this attitude of like, we're just free people who live in nature was far from being like, as the French imagined, this kind of noble savage, like they just evolved this way in harmony with nature. It's like an explicit political rejection and fuck you to the Aztec style Cahokian priest king dictatorship. You know what I mean? So like things that we think of as sort of like, oh, well, this is just from time eternal, are like, they probably have we just lost it. We just lost the history of the Americas, but they probably have just as like complex political up and down history with different people making different decisions. And like, you know, there's as the old world did that we know about, but because everybody died from the smallpox and like there was so much destruction and the missionaries destroyed all their records, we think like, oh, they were living that way from time immemorial. But like,
hey listeners, this is future Ben. I'm editing this episode and I'm listening to past Ben excitedly rant about a book he remembers somewhat vaguely and getting carried away in his usual fashion. And I don't usually jump in like this, but this requires clarification. The we that past Ben keeps using is a very settler we, and I'm kind of perpetuating a shitty myth here about First Nations people going extinct. Actually, Kondiaronk's people, the Wyandot, also known as the Huron, are still around, and they still have their history. And that's mostly how two white guys were able to write a book about it, which I then rant about. Okay, back to the episode.
So I'm not sure.
Anyway.
I'm gonna. I don't disagree with anything you're saying. Again, like
No.
I'm not sure it's always a reaction to
No.
that. So you know, like I'm thinking of like the conversations
I'm not saying
I had.
always.
I'm just saying like the conversations I had with the Hawaiian science fiction writers when I was out there, and their relationship to the land, which is certainly political in a bunch of ways.
Sure.
But and even for myself, if I was going to be religious, I mean, I, you know, my major hobby is gardening, right? Like if I had a religion, it would probably be nature in some way. And I'm kind of thinking about that in terms of environmentalism and, you know, whatever, like there's a certain kind of like, and you can pitch it as a resistance to capitalism or whatever else, but it feels more fundamental than that. But anyway, I don't
mean to say, I'm not making the claim that everything is just from a reaction to the previous thing. I'm not saying that, because I think that would make it seem like, I don't think that's true of religion. I also think it's true of art. It's not true that every artwork is like just talking about, just pushing back on the previous artwork you saw. I'm not saying that. But I mean, lots of things are also, they are fundamental. You are tapping into, when you're writing a story, you're tapping into first order things. You're writing from life. You're writing from, how do I feel? How do the people around me act? What have I actually seen? What have I actually experienced? That's always in there. you're always, so reverence for nature, sure, that's like a primal, like everyone's had the experience of like going into a forest. I hope everyone's had the experience going to the forest and feeling like the grandeur and beauty of nature, right? But so many things that go into the mix are always like primal, but also we never get outside of history, right? So we're never like just having this romantic, capital R, you know, in the sense of the romantic movement, like, you know, oneness with the, like, sure, but also you're always enmeshed in a political moment, and you're always, you know, like, no accident, the romantics are having this oneness with nature just after, like, while they're quarreling with the previous generation who has this, you know, age of reason, like, you know, so it's like, and it's funny that Switzerland is interesting for this because Switzerland, the Swiss Alps, were like a hard and terrible place to live for a long time. And the narrative about it was definitely like, it sucks. Like, this sucks. It's a dangerous, that mountain is fucking dangerous. And then it became, in precisely the Romantic era, this center of the first European, well, not the first because that was pilgrimage, the first secular European wave of tourism, right? It was like, we'll go to the Alps for our health and because they're beautiful. And so people like the Byron and all those guys were coming and writing about you've been to like villages in Switzerland where they talk about the history of this, where the people who were the first, I remember that I was in a little town in the Swiss Alps reading about the town history, and it was like the first guys who realized they could cash in on this and like give tours in the mountains, and like all of a sudden the iconography of the mountains shifted from them being this like hellish, dangerous hellscape you had to survive to being like so beautiful and like oneness with nature and like which doesn't mean those feelings weren't real, because the Swiss people in the Alps truly revere them, but also they're not detached from history. So anyway.
All right, I'm going to rein us in because we've run over.
It's about time. Yeah, we've gone over.
I'm going to say, so I had one final thought of something I'm struggling with in my writing related to all this, and I guess a question for you of like whether there's anything parallel for you. So I've been working on getting my backlist up on ebooks, right? Like getting the rights back from publishers and just making it available to the world again. Hopefully it'll make a nice income stream eventually. And you know, put a little more of the control in my hands instead of big corporate entities. So as part of that, I have these stories I wrote a long time ago, these like long short stories, like 10,000 words, for Puritan, which was a hardcore porn magazine. And so they're sex stories. They had a formula they wanted me to follow, which was like a sex scene every 1,000 words. So they're a little more.
I want to know. Wait, I need to know how many of the words. How many words was the sex scene? Like, was it 1,000 words every 1,000 words?
No.
Could it be like 20 words every 1,000 words?
They did not specify that. So
that's funny.
But I enjoyed writing them.
And they had sex, so it could be. Well, then they had sex.
Yes. So I had to make them entertaining for me, which meant that because. So like I did one that was like a Thomas the Rhymer one that was like a murder mystery on a dirigible, you know.
Cool.
They were really, I had a lot of fun with them. I think I did 6 of them. Some of them were, so I've been rereading them and I find them a little shocking, which is interesting, right? And especially there's one in particular that is set at like a convent and has it has incubi and succubi and nuns and priests and, you know, all having sex. And I'm like, whoa.
A little blasphemous.
This is a little blasphemous, right? And
but what kind of shocking? Go into shocking. What do you mean by shocking?
That's the thing. I'm like, did I really write this? And it is, you know, I think most of the erotica I wrote was in the context of, you know, like character-driven stories, right? And so I never really felt like it was particularly titillating. Like it didn't set out to just like do that, right? This kind of does. Like this is meant to be like a fun romp with a lot of sex in it. And I'm finding myself.
The other stories are erotica and these are porn, basically.
Yeah, and I'm finding myself a little hesitant to put them out under my own name. I'm actually thinking of using a transparent pseudonym for them, so they're at least delineated a little bit. Yeah, branded separately, but also like, you know, I think it's that conservative impulse, right? Delaney talks about how society is always going to push you towards the most conservative position possible, right? And it's like you
I
know,
mean, you know what Delaney would say. But
so,
anyway, go on.
right. So, but like, just to give an example, it's weird
Sure.
to find this in yourself, right?
Yeah.
I'm poly. In my 20s, I had all kinds of poly relationships and talked about them openly. But then, and I'm still poly, but you know, Kevin and I had kids and
You slowed down.
moved to the suburbs, and people assumed that we were a standard straight couple, right? Monogamous couple. And so it became this constant coming out process, and it continues because people still assume that, of like, no, I'm bi, no, I'm poly, I'm hosting the local Upalga potluck next Friday, you know, like, let me just keep telling you. But like, there was a moment when Jed came to visit from out of town, and I found myself hesitating to hold his hand walking down the street, because what if we ran into a neighbor who assumed I was cheating on Kevin?
Cheating. Yeah.
Right. And I got over it, but I had to kind of push past it. And this feels,
I feel like there should be some like well understood social cues. Like you should be able to have a flag, or like just get T-shirts that say "Poly not cheating." So when you're walking down holding Jed's hand, people be able to.
And this was a decade ago, right? So at this point, I think people are more familiar with poly. So maybe when we jump to that assumption, and Bujold has the Bajorans, the Bujold has.
Those are Star Trek, I think.
Those are Star Trek. I've been watching a lot of Voyager. That she has the Batons have like earrings that are coded that everyone wears.
Yeah.
So that you know.
Sure.
You know, gay people had a handkerchief code.
Right.
You know, et cetera, so on. Right. There are things, but there's nothing easy to do for poly at the moment. So we used to wear a parrot. Like there's
a parrot.
Poly parrot, like
Polly the parrot, Polly on a cracker.
Yeah. So if you see someone with parrot jewelry, it can be a quiet symbol of poly. But regardless, I'm finding this feels like the same thing. And I'm like, I'm in this moment of like, is it that I'm hesitating to put these out because they're not that well written or something, you know, like that, like my
Do you like them?
You know, it's 30 years later. It's hard for me to separate it out. I think that's where I'm like, I'm a little like, because I'm a little shocked reading them. I have to I think I'm gonna have to read them a couple times to get past that emotional moment. I'm still not really
getting what kind of shocked? Like shocked as if someone else had wrote them and you were encountering them and you weren't ready for it to be so sexual, and they're super sexual.
They're more shameless. They 20-year-old me had very little in the way of boundaries, right? And so I just wrote whatever came into my head. Lots of things came into my head, and now 50-year-old me is a pillar of the community, and so it's just, you know. So I'm like, and it makes me wonder how much of my current writing am I censoring myself without even realizing it. That's, you know, like, would I be writing differently now if I was really pushing myself to not think about what society thinks? So this was my question for you. This was all set up, was whether
I have more questions though. I will answer your question ultimately, but I do have more questions, and I wanna fix your problem as always. You know, I want to come up with ideas.
I'll tell you the question.
Brainstorm.
The question for you is there anything that functions this way for you? Anything you hesitate
to
write
about? But that's another good question, but I'm not quite there yet. So because I do have a question and an idea. So my question is, because it sounds like, well, I'm unclear on what you I mean, I know you're unclear too, but I want to sort of push on what you actually think aesthetically. That is to say, are you no longer, is it alienating because this is no longer a project aesthetically that you're actually interested in? Or is it, on the contrary, the way you're talking, it's sort of like, this feels like, shocking as it is, like your mind being free, and you wonder whether, like, and it's like, do you know what I mean? Like, I kind of still like so I kind of still wanted to answer the question of if you think they're good.
Well, that's the
like
thing.
In your terms, though, in your term, do you?
So I think both, right? I mean, so the thing is like, even if they're not as good as what I'm writing now on a prose level or whatever else, I think I'd be okay with, I can always put a preface in, like, I wrote these in my early 20s, you know, and I'm re-releasing them now. Enjoy, you know, like, and I think that basically takes care of the skill quality, whatever argument.
Yeah, but I wasn't really talking about skill quality. It's more like, are you alienated by the project of who this writer is, or are you just like, what will the neighbors think?
Yeah, I mean, she feels a little alien to me. It's hard. Like, that's what I mean. When I started reading it, I was like, did I really write these? Okay, I do. I did. I do remember writing them, but that mindset is very far from my current mind. I think a lot more about consequences now than I did back then, you know?
But do you think,
but I don't know
but
if
if you
good.
met her,
Yeah.
if you met her at a party, the
Yeah.
20-year-old or however old she is.
Oh no, if she's one of my students, right? And is writing
or if she's one of your students
stuff,
and she turns these in, exactly. What would you?
how would you react? No, I'd tell her to go for it. Yeah, no, I would. Yeah, so you know, so
okay, so it's not like you have qualms like
it's
the
not
nuns
really about the
screwing
work.
the incubuses are like potentially gonna do harm by upsetting
not really
somebody,
right? Yeah,
okay,
I mean,
yeah, no, it's really just what do the neighbors think.
Yeah,
okay.
I think that's really what it comes down to.
Well, I think that what I think you should do when you put these up as part of your backlist is what I was going to go in kind of the same direction, but rather than just saying, "Oh, haha, I wrote these in my 20s," I actually think it'd be interesting if you wrote like forwards and afterwards. If you like put them in context, I think it would actually be a very interesting project. That would be cool. Be like, these are these hardcore stories, porn stories I wrote in my what I kind of want as an aesthetic project. I'm not trying to give you more work, but is like your memories of being that girl who wrote those stories, where you were, what your life was like, what it's like looking back on it now. Precisely the thing you're talking about. Just I'm not saying a million words, but like a 1,000-word preface of each, or a 500-word preface of each one, where it's like, this is what this story, and like just with all that in there about like I'm both excited for this girl and also a little worried for her, and I'm like shocked what the neighbors will think, and like, who am I anymore that I'm having these feelings, and why aren't I still her? Like, I think it would be very interesting to have these hardcore porn stories with the companion pieces of like introspection about putting out the hardcore bit. That sounds like it'd be a great like ebook.
All right, I will think about it. I think we were originally going to release them as like little like Kindle singles kind of things.
Yeah.
And then
you could do the same thing. Kindle singles with a forward
and then also put them all together into a book. Yeah.
Well, you could do either way. I also think the I mean, I don't know, the transparent pseudonym is interesting. I don't know if it's necessary. In your case, you're so eclectic anyway. Like a lot of times people do that because they have two lines. They want to be this is the Ian Banks. This is, you know what you're getting from Ian Banks. You know what you're getting from Ian M. Banks, right?
Right.
But like in this case, I don't know. You don't know what you're getting from Merriman and Rowan Raj anyway. So
yeah.
But I mean, if you decide that it's outside the pale of what, I mean, it could still be a useful marker or whatever to somehow signify it. All right. So is there anything like that for me? Is your question?
Yeah, I guess. Do you think that there's anything? I guess. Anything that you hesitate to write, not because you firmly feel it would be an ethical problem, but more because of social pressure, because of that kind of fear of censure.
Yeah, I mean, there's some things like that I think they're mixed together, the ethical thing and the fear of censure, because I don't think it's so easily distinguishable. I think there are things that I hesitate writing about or that are hard for me to write about because I'm afraid of getting them wrong and doing harm, but also handling the fallout for them. I mean, the obvious thing that comes to mind is I feel like I've had some kind of urge to write about like The City of Peace is a story I wrote about the Israel-Palestine conflict in Other Cities, which actually didn't come out in the Strange Horizons version of Other Cities. It's only in the chapbook because Jed didn't want to. I think Jed was a little bit like, this story is too political. And so it came out in the Small Beer Press chapbook. I think it's the only one, probably not accidentally. It's the only one of the Other Cities that I don't think is online. I actually just went to look for it, and I was like, I never put this online, did I? It's just in the chapbook. I could
put it up on your site.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I 100% could.
And talk about it in the context. I mean, that would be interesting.
Yeah, and could well, I will if you will. But I mean, that's not even so. I mean, like that one, yes, I'd be fine putting that up. That was sort of very abstract, and it was in the Other Cities mode of like this metaphorical city or whatever. But like, I do feel like I feel also like I was at the time. I think I was more like that was written this is early in my career, right? So this is around 2000 and 2001 when I wrote The Other Cities. I feel like I had a stronger like sense of what they should do and more hope and more like I know
Mm.
what the right side of history is. And it's not that I don't know what the right side of history is in the sense that can't we all just get along is always the right side of history, but like what that means operationally,
Yeah.
like what that actually looks like.
How do we get from here to there? Yeah.
Yeah, and like how I mean, and just how um both more both more aware of my privilege as a diaspora Jew who does not have to deal
Mm.
with the shit and is not, you know what I mean? And my
Mm.
and how it's inappropriate for me to like if I don't want them if I'm mad at Netanyahu doing things in my name, by the same token, I should not like appoint myself spokesman.
Mm-hmm.
Right? Like in some way, I think everybody should figure it out and they should figure it out without fucking the rest, the rest of us
Mm.
uh playing the game of dividing them up into teams and pitting them against each other, which I think is what the rest of the world
Mm-hmm.
does, particularly in such a high profile conflict. And it's funny because I often think about, I mean, often when I do talk about this, like the because we've talked so much about, the parallels between different like ethnic conflicts that as diasporans we're sort of related to, but also not. Like we both have skin in the
Mm-hmm.
game and also not. Like, I often think about the difference between like it's both bad to be underreported, like for the war in
Mm-hmm.
Sri Lanka to like make no headlines and no one cares. And also it's also not great when it's so overreported that everybody in the world has an opinion about it. Like
Yeah.
everybody in Europe has picked a side, which is
Mm-hmm.
like really not helpful and funnels money into like all the evangelical Christians who've decided that Israel should conquer the West Bank because that's the biblical homeland and like they're funneling money into the right wing
Yeah.
Israel, right? Like that. It's just like I kind of envy conflicts that nobody cares about and don't make the
Yeah.
paper because at least I mean it's still not great because then what often happens is that like I don't know the big multinationals are still going in and like
Mm-hmm.
if it's a conflict in Congo or whatever it's De Beers or the oil
Right,
company or
right.
whatever like somebody else is still meddling but with Israel Palestine it's literally everybody meddling but yeah anyway so that but and it's also like both that I'm like conscious of that I'm also so deeply disappointed and also just like
Mm.
feel suckered. I feel
Mm.
suckered by because I went so the brief history of what I don't the brief summary of the article that I keep not writing. I mean, I've sort of,
Mm-hmm.
at various points said various things about it, but um like I remember I have this very vivid like I spent 6 months in Israel in 1990 and like partly on a journey to figure out like what I thought about it and at the time I was like there is a very like I went with this worry about whether having grown up in like a Zionist household since the 1870s and like but going to a university in the middle of the first intifada where Israel was clearly the villain I was like which side am I going to have to pick? This is going to be so harsh. And then I
Mm.
was like, oh, the peace side. That seems easy. And it was a time of great optimism where like the Israeli left and like the Palestinian, secular forces were
Mm-hmm.
like, let's have a two-state solution. And I was
Yeah.
like, that sounds great. Like, well, they just need to figure it out. And there was like this all this, and there was all this both like pomp and about handshakes on the lawn, but then also secret back channel negotiations. And like I think
Mm-hmm.
historically, like places where they got close. And I would think that this was all just like a ruse, except at the same time, Northern Ireland got solved. I'm
Mm-hmm.
very jealous. Like they actually, it's the same period. The peace processes were going on in parallel.
Yeah.
And the fact is, the problem is that in Northern Ireland, there were no great powers that had it didn't have any use for any of the great powers anywhere. America and Britain, or you know what I mean? There was nobody, the Soviet
Mm.
Union was gone, and there was nobody who was like, you know what I
Yeah.
mean? Like it was like everybody, it was just the Irish just wanted to join the EU. Ireland, the Republic of Ireland, was just like,
Yeah.
can you stop making a mess so we can join the EU? And England, to their paramilitaries, were like, guys, cut it the fuck out. So there was no like instead of
Yeah.
people feeding from all sides being like these are the good guys no these are the good guys it's like everybody was like so that created the conditions under which the
Mm-hmm.
moderates could actually make a deal and in Israel the opposite happened and everything fell apart and um but since I've been getting letters from Americans for Peace now for the last 30 years and they
Mm.
always say like this is the last moment to make peace and have a two-state solution. It'll any longer it'll be lost. They've been saying that for 30 years.
Yeah.
I feel suckered in the sense that while we were like earnestly wringing our hands about it, Netanyahu went and put up barbed wire over. There is no two states anymore because the entire West Bank is like full of barbed wire and Israeli swimming pools. Like it was so completely colonized that like, I don't know, like at this point, I'm like, I don't know, a revolution in a binational state, maybe, I don't know. Or like, but again, who am I to say that? So
I mean, in Sri Lanka, we had a similar kind of like, they were looking for a two-state solution. We didn't really have the same religious element that you guys have there, where Jerusalem is this big problem and, et cetera, right? So, there was a ceasefire in 2005 that, seemed like it might be going somewhere. The Norwegians came and like, held peace talks in Oslo and like, but then it kind of ran aground and I don't know. I don't know whether it ran aground on like individual politicians' egos. I think that often plays a big part in this.
Right.
And then the fighting resumed, and then in the end, the government won. Right. So it became, they crushed whether you want to think of them as terrorists or revolutionaries is up to you. Right. And then they were like, now we'll have peace. And after 30 years of conflict, I think the Tamil people were exhausted, right? Like there was not at that point any like, and had felt many of them betrayed by what the Tigers did in their name as well.
Sure.
Right. And so people just accepted it. I mean, like also many civilians were slaughtered in the final push. So there was a lot of fear and a lot of like, if you try and, you'll just get killed if you try and speak up against the government at this point. And I don't know. I mean, I'm glad we're not at war anymore.
Right.
And there have been some steps towards equality, but there's also still so much that is being denied. There's so much corruption in the government. There's I mean, Sri Lanka was on the brink of economic collapse recently. We still have occasional conflicts like the Easter Sunday bombings and so on. So I don't know. It feels like everyone's holding their breath, and like, will the next generation be able to take over from these terrible old men and do something better? Right. I don't know. So sorry, that was depressing. But I guess to go back to the writing question, then I think we really should close.
Well, the last thing I want to say about the Israel thing is just now there's like a wave of, I don't even know whether to call it hope, but there is like a huge Netanyahu has overplayed his hand. There is now like massive like demonstrations. I mean, there's like a huge wave of popular. Now, who knows what that'll turn into? And it's not really one-to-one analogous. It's about him destroying Israeli democracy. It's not really about but like to some extent, it's like the only thing. Like I don't know. It seems like the the only, I don't know, like having some kind of I'm agnostic about I used to have like opinions, you know what I mean? It's like, well, they should have two states and it should be fair and whatever. Now I'm like, I don't know, like maybe it should be 5 states, maybe it should be 1 state, maybe it's a civil rights struggle for like the people who, you know what I mean? Actually would be better if Netanyahu annexed everything and gave them all passports and they were Israelis, and then it's an apartheid struggle, you know what I mean? Like, but I don't know, like then it's a civil rights issue. You're anyway, I don't know, but I'm saying it's like see, this is why you were asking me, the original meta topic was like, am I hesitant to talk about things? This is something that affects me so deeply emotionally, and also I'm clearly full of shit about. Like I lived there for 6 months when I was 20 and I'm 50. I don't know shit. Right. So that there's a way in which it's like, well, that's
the research. Weird. This is why I stopped writing directly about Sri Lanka, because it is going to require research. And like other topics, like, trans stuff. I've written one story with a trans character. I ran it by a bunch of my trans friends. I feel like it's okay. But I really hesitate to say anything on trans stuff because I feel like I haven't done my research yet. Like
Yeah,
I've been
yeah.
recommended books and I haven't read them yet, and I need, like I just,
Yeah.
like I'm ignorant, and I know I'm ignorant, so I
Yes.
tread
But
very warily
that
there.
kind of thing feels a little bit different because it's like, it's okay if I'm ignorant. I mean, like I went through a whole, like I had to do, but I feel like the unraveling was very much moving into that
Right.
space.
Well,
It was
and
clearly
this
very
and this
much about
this
that.
isn't, yeah,
So I
this
had to
isn't,
do a lot of research.
yeah.
It's like, well, I don't know about this, but I'll educate myself. But my attitude is like, well, you tell me, right? But the weird thing about being diasporan in this sense, right, is that it's like I can't if I was going to write about Sri Lanka, I'd be like, oh, well, I don't know, tell me. Like I'm open to learn. Like I don't have a dog in this fight. I'm like, what's weird is being so emotionally invested and not having,
but this kind of goes back to like, me wearing a tank top in Pakistan. I can do that because I'm not a local, right?
Yeah,
And
yeah.
so there's a way in which I think it's important that the diasporan perspective has value. It's not,
Sure.
it should not necessarily be privileged over the homelander perspective.
Sure.
But it's a different angle of vision, right? And it can maybe illuminate things that might be obscured for someone who's enmeshed day to day in the culture,
Yeah.
right? And in the conflict.
I mean, I should say this is actually less about fiction because I don't think I'm necessarily drawn to, like, I mean, it informs this informs things metaphorically, but I'm less.
Be the next novel.
No, I don't think. I mean, no, I don't really think. I don't know. I think I don't think that's the. It's also so. In some ways, it's like in terms of fiction. When you said there are other things you hesitate about, I was thinking about this because this is the thing I hesitate about. But I'm talking about like non-fictionally.
That's okay.
I mean, I'm talking like making pronouncements or whatever.
Right.
Or like appeals or something. But I mean, in terms of fiction, I think it's partly my reaction in terms of fiction is it's like both the Israeli-Palestinian conflict and the Holocaust are so overplayed. Like they're so like the dominant narrative. Like I'm much more interested in writing about, I don't know, Talmudic squabbles in the 3rd century BC or something, or AD, which would be like, that'd be really interesting because like who does that? Like I want to,
I'd be interested though. I mean, I'm just
right, exactly.
Just saying.
Well, that's what I'm saying. Oh, you'd be interested about the Israeli conflict.
I'm interested. I'm interested in Ben's science fictional take on, talking about this through that lens. Like Arcady Martin has done some really interesting things with Empire recently, and I'm like, I could.
I mean, I'm sure it would. I'm sure it. I mean, obviously, I think it informs all kinds of things that I do, but also what my direction has been the opposite of that in a way that like I very much like, as I said, like in my 20s, I went there. I felt like a strong connection. I felt like I had an opinion, and I feel more and more like I am like diaspora Jew is a very specific identity, and like I am actually interested in, like that's the part I'm into. Like it's not that I'm not uninterested, but it's like it's actually like one thing I want to correct for is this sort of centrality of the narrative of it's like, do you know what I mean? They killed us, then we fled, then we went here, then we had this fight, and now we're fucking a fight forever. Like that's the whole.
It doesn't have to be
the story.
It doesn't have to be your project
in some ways.
I'm fine with it not being your project. I think that the only thing I'd poke at is, is it not your project because you're really interested in other things more and they matter more to you? Or is it not your project because it hurts too much or it's...
Well, I mean, I think I do know what you mean. And I think it is, well, it's a good point. I think it's a little bit both, but I think it's sort of like, I don't know. I mean, we'll see what happens. I don't think it's certainly not. It's not at the phase of incubation where I'd be like, this is the thing I need to write about.
No,
also, I just feel like there's other people. You know what I mean? It doesn't feel like, oh, I'm holding myself back from this. It feels like, I mean, there already is Lavi Tidhart. There already is the Yiddish Policemen's Union. Like I've seen lots of like it's like I don't know. Like I don't feel the thing I'm writing now, which is about the shtetl. It's about European history of Judaism, which is, I mean, I'm not in Poland, but I'm here. I'm in Europe. And like, I feel like, or like, actually, what I really want to write about is the massacre of the Jews during the Black Plague in Basel, like where they put them all in a barn and burned it in an island in the Rhine. That's like near my house. The 675th anniversary is coming up of like. When they killed all the Jews in Basel, and then Jews were banned from Basel that's like literally where I live. Like that seems much more, and that's nobody is going to do that. Do you know what I mean? Like, I mean, well, maybe somebody Swiss, but like, you know, in English, I don't think anyone but me would write a fantasy novel set in Black Plague Basel, right? With the Jews. You know, that's just not going to happen. And so it's kind of a different, I don't know, like it's a
No, that sounds great too. I'm in favor.
I don't know. But I mean, I know what you mean. Like like there's the it not being necessarily a project that's incubated, but there, as you say, like there's a wound. So that's it. I mean, in a way, it's like there's
a power there, right? And it's a question of like,
it's a question of figuring out. And it's not, and I think it's the wrong. I think actually that it's like the right way to take that would be that it's actually about, right? It's like put it in space, because it's not about the actual Israel-Palestine conflict. It's about my like relationship as somebody growing up in a totally different place to this thing that's happening that ineluctably like has to do with me. And that's you know, that's like a class. Like I don't know that I experience a lot of microaggressions in my life, but that feels like the very, like, you find out I'm Jewish and you start talking to me about Israel Palestine immediately, asking if I'm interested. Like that feels like it's a very like it's a way that the world keeps telling me that I am connected to this, if I like it or not. Like it's that I'm fundamentally situated in relationship to it. Anyway, so
well, I have a TV episode recommendation for everyone. So Dairy Girls is an Irish show.
Oh, I love Dairy Girls.
Yeah, so it's set during, I'm just telling people, it's set in the 1990s, and season 3, episode 7, which is I think as far as they've gotten so far. You could watch this episode by itself, although it would be better if you watched all 3 seasons. And it's a delightful show. But it takes place, episode 7 takes place, it's the last episode of the season, takes place during the week of the Good Friday Accords. And they do an amazing job of showing the complexities of choosing peace. After decades of conflict. I mean, I
love that show. I watch it with Aviva. That's one of our shows.
Just heartbreaking. Like they did such a good job with showing how hard it is. So I just recommend it to everyone. So anyway,
it's also very funny. I mean, I don't know about that episode, but I haven't gotten that far. But it's a very funny show.
It's a very funny show overall.
It's a very the comedy is great. Anyway, So
I think we should wrap.
Yes.
we could clearly.
It's a good question to dig into in a future episode, because I'm sure there's more stuff that we avoid writing about, or you know, whatever.
Well,
but
I'll be seeing Ben soon at WisCon, and then again he's going to be
Could
here
have in person.
Well, he'll be here when we're teaching Clarion, so I'm sure some more meaty things will come out of both of those.
No doubt. We could try having an in-person episode. Also, we should probably, when I'm there for WisCon, do more like actual nuts and bolts off-air menu planning. No, lesson planning. Menu planning. Lesson.
Lesson
the
planning.
Teaching.
Yes. So
what happens on what day and whatever.
All right.
I went to the workshop for the instructors.
Did I miss?
Are you not getting those mails?
No. I think
you might have signed up for a different date.
I signed up for a different date. I think tomorrow. I think I have one. So
no.
Okay. Anyway, we should close out this episode.
We should.
Okay. So thank you, everybody. I hope.
Stay human.
This has been interesting. I think it's interesting.
Pieces of it were interesting.
Pieces.
Certainly.
Yes.
No doubt. Yeah.
Absolutely. Go out and transgress. So, but only only in ways that feel authentic to you.
Thoughtfully transgress.
Yeah,
transgress authentically.
Authentically and ethically. Yes.
Yes. and with the knowledge that you may create something of great beauty, which then becomes the next dogma that has to be transgressed against.
That's right.
A good thing to keep in mind.
And choose your risk level consciously, right?
Yes.
So
stay safe out there.
Stay safe as much as you can. Unless you decide something's more important than staying safe.
Yeah, that's also possible.
Yeah. All right. Thanks, guys.